The stage driver had warned her 3 times before they even left Cheyenne. "Ma'am, that crossing ain't safe this time of year. Spring melt turns it mean." Evelyn Carter hadn't listened. She'd spent 6 months exchanging letters with Silas Boone, building a fantasy of frontier life that probably had nothing to do with reality, and she wasn't about to let some nervous driver talk her out of the only chance she had at starting over. Boston had chewed her up and spit her out. A school teacher past 25 with no family, no prospects, and a landlady who looked at her like she was already a ghost. When Silas's first letter arrived, rough and honest and lonely in a way that made her chest ache, she'd written back that same night. Now, watching dark clouds swallow the Wyoming sky, she wondered if desperation had made her stupid. The wagon lurched through another pothole, throwing her against the wooden side hard enough to bruise. Rain hammered the canvas cover, turning the trail into a river of mud. Through the gap in the fabric, Evelyn could see the crossing ahead. What should have been a shallow ford across Black Ridge Creek had transformed into something vicious and swollen, churning with debris from upstream. "We ain't making it across that," the driver shouted over the storm. "We gotta turn back." "How far to Wolf Creek?" Evelyn yelled. 10 miles, maybe more in this mess." "And how far back to the last town?" The driver didn't answer, which told her everything. They were stuck between 2 bad choices, and turning back meant another night on the trail, another day of delay, another moment of doubt eating at her resolve. Silas was expecting her. She'd sent a telegram from Cheyenne 3 days ago. He'd be waiting at the settlement, probably wondering if she'd changed her mind, if she was another woman who'd taken one look at the frontier and run screaming back to civilization. "Cross it," Evelyn said. "Lady, you're crazy. I said cross it." The driver swore, but he snapped the reins. The horses balked, spooked by the roaring water, but he forced them forward. The wagon wheels hit the flood with an impact that rattled Evelyn's teeth. Water sprayed through every gap in the canvas, soaking her traveling dress, her carefully packed trunk, the leather bag containing every letter Silas had ever sent her. For a few seconds, it seemed like they might make it. The horses strained against the current, the driver screaming encouragement, the wagon rocking but holding steady. Evelyn gripped the seat, her knuckles white, praying to something she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Then the wheel caught on something beneath the surface. A rock, a submerged log, maybe just the force of the water itself. The wagon tilted, slow at first, almost gentle. Evelyn had time to think, "This isn't happening," before the whole thing flipped. She hit the water hard. Cold punched the air from her lungs. The current grabbed her like a living thing, dragging her under, spinning her until she couldn't tell up from down. Her skirts wrapped around her legs, heavy as iron chains. She clawed toward what she hoped was the surface, broke through gasping, and saw the wagon rolling past her like a broken toy. The driver already swept downstream, the horses screaming in panic. Something slammed into her back. A piece of the wagon, maybe. Or debris from upstream. Pain exploded through her ribs. She went under again, swallowing mud and water, her lungs burning, her hands grasping at nothing. The cold was worse than the pain. It sank into her bones, turned her muscles to lead, whispered that it would be easier to just let go. "This is how I die," she thought with strange clarity. Alone in the mud, like I always knew I would. Then hands locked around her arm, brutal and strong, yanking her up through the current. She broke the surface coughing, half drowned, and found herself staring at a face that could have been carved from the mountains themselves. All hard angles and old scars, eyes like winter, dark hair plastered to a skull that looked like it had survived things that would have killed most men. "Don't fight me," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "You fight, we both drown." Evelyn tried to speak, but only managed to cough up more water. The man, Silas, it has to be Silas, wrapped one arm around her waist and hauled her toward the bank, fighting the current with a strength that seemed impossible. His horse, a massive gray gelding, stood chest-deep in the flood, ears pinned back but holding steady. Silas shoved Evelyn toward the animal, then pulled himself up behind her in one fluid motion. The horse lunged for shore, muscles bunching, hooves finding purchase on the slick rocks. They collapsed on this bank in a tangle of limbs and mud. Evelyn lay there shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might crack. The rain kept falling. Somewhere downstream, the wagon was probably matchsticks by now. Everything she owned, gone. 6 months of planning, wiped out in 60 seconds of bad judgment. Evelyn Carter? The man crouched beside her, water streaming from his coat. Up close she could see the scar that split his left eyebrow, another that curved along his jaw, the kind of marks a person collected from years of surviving what shouldn't be survived. She managed to nod. Silas Boone. He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile, didn't do anything except study her with those winter eyes. You're early. The telegram, she coughed again, her ribs screaming. I sent it from Cheyenne. Never got it. Was going to ride out to the crossing tomorrow to check. He stood scanning the flooded creek. Driver make it? I don't know. Silas swore under his breath, but he didn't waste time. He stripped off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was soaked through, but still held some warmth from his body. Can you ride? Evelyn tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I don't think so. Then you're riding with me. He lifted her without asking permission, settling her in front of him on the horse like she weighed nothing. His arm locked around her waist again, and Evelyn was suddenly, inappropriately aware of how solid he felt, how his chest pressed against her back, how his breath stirred her wet hair. In his letters, he'd described himself as a simple rancher, nothing special, just a man trying to make a living in hard country. He hadn't mentioned that he was built like something that should have been extinct, or that his hands were scarred from what looked like a lifetime of fighting. The horse started moving before she could protest, picking its way through the mud with the careful precision of an animal that knew one wrong step could be fatal. Rain continued to hammer them. Lightning split the sky, turning everything white for a heartbeat. In that flash, Evelyn caught a glimpse of the valley ahead, dark pines clinging to steep slopes, mountains rising like walls on both sides, and somewhere in that wilderness, the ranch where she was supposed to start her new life. Your things, Silas said after a long silence. They all gone? Everything. Evelyn's voice came out flat. Clothes, books, money, even the letters. She felt him stiffen slightly behind her. The letters I sent you? Yes. Another long silence. The horse kept moving, following some trail only it could see in the storm. Evelyn's shaking had gotten worse. Her wet clothes clung to her like ice, and the cold had worked its way so deep into her core that she wondered if she'd ever be warm again. There's a line shack about 2 miles up, Silas said finally. We'll hole up there till the storm breaks. You need to get dry or you're going to be sick. The settlement's 10 miles from here and you're half frozen already. We push through this, you'll be dead before we get there. His tone didn't allow for argument. Line shack's got a stove and dry wood. We'll wait it out. Evelyn wanted to protest. Something about propriety, about how it wasn't right for her to spend the night alone with a man she'd just met, about how this wasn't how any of this was supposed to go. But her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. And besides, what did propriety matter when you'd already drowned and been dragged back to life by a stranger who was supposed to be your husband? The line shack appeared through the rain like a ghost. A small, rough structure barely bigger than a shed, half hidden under a stand of pines. Silas dismounted and pulled Evelyn down after him, then kicked the door open. Inside smelled like old smoke and animal fur, but it was dry, and there was a small iron stove in the corner with a stack of split wood beside it. Silas settled Evelyn on a bench against the wall, then went to work building a fire with the efficient movements of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in worse conditions. The flames caught quickly, hungry and bright. Heat started to fill the tiny space. Evelyn huddled close to the stove, still shaking, watching Silas move around the shack. He stripped off his wet shirt without self-consciousness, revealing a torso mapped with more scars, something that looked like a knife wound along his ribs, a puckered mark on his shoulder that could only be a bullet, long white lines across his back that made her stomach turn. He caught her staring and paused. Told you in the letters I wasn't pretty. You didn't mention you'd been through a war. Didn't fight in a war, just lived here. He grabbed a rough blanket from a shelf and tossed it to her. Get out of those wet clothes before you freeze. I'll turn around. Evelyn's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress. Everything was soaked through, plastered to her skin, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the fastenings. After a minute of struggle, she gave up and just sat there, dripping and miserable. I can't, she admitted quietly. My hands won't work. Silas turned back to her, his face unreadable. For a long moment he just stood there, and Evelyn felt a spike of fear. Not of him, exactly, but of the situation, of how vulnerable she was, of how completely her life had spun out of her control in the space of an hour. Then he crouched in front of her, his hands moving to the buttons of her dress with surprising gentleness. "Tell me if I'm making you uncomfortable," he said, his voice low. "Everything about this is uncomfortable." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough." He worked the buttons open with practiced efficiency, helping her shrug out of the sodden dress, then wrapped the blanket around her shoulders before she was too exposed. Boots, too. Wet feet'll kill you as quick as anything. Evelyn let him unlace her boots, too exhausted and cold to care about propriety anymore. When he pulled them off, along with her stockings, she saw that her feet were blue-white with cold, the toes worryingly numb. Silas swore again and started rubbing them with rough, warm hands, forcing circulation back. The pins and needles sensation as feeling returned was almost worse than the cold. "You got a hell of a way of making a first impression," he said, still working on her feet. "I could say the same about you." "Yeah, well, I warned you this country was hard. Told you in the letters it wasn't like Boston. You said it was challenging. You didn't say it was actively trying to murder me." That got an actual sound from him. Not a laugh exactly, but something close. He finished with her feet and stood, hanging her dress and undergarments near the stove to dry. Then he pulled another blanket around his own shoulders and settled on the floor with his back against the wall, giving her the bench. Outside, the storm raged on. Thunder rolled through the valley like artillery fire. Inside the line shack, the fire crackled and popped, gradually pushing back the cold. Evelyn pulled the blanket tighter and studied the man across from her. This stranger she'd agreed to marry, based on a handful of letters, and a photograph that hadn't done justice to how intimidating he was in person. "Thank you," she said finally. "For pulling me out." Silas shrugged. "Couldn't let you drown. Would have been a waste of postage." "That's a terrible joke." "Wasn't joking." But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of humor maybe, or just exhaustion. "You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be rough." "I'm not sure I can sleep." Evelyn's whole body felt like one giant bruise, and her mind kept replaying the moment the wagon flipped, the sensation of drowning, the certainty that she was going to die alone in the mud. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in the water." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "First winter I was here, I got caught in a blizzard 15 miles from the ranch. Couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Horse broke his leg in a snowdrift. Had to put him down. Walked for 2 days straight, no food, no shelter, just me and the cold. By the time I found the ranch, I had frostbite so bad they thought they'd have to take 3 fingers. He held up his left hand, showing where the tips of his ring and middle fingers were slightly misshapen. Kept 'em, but they don't work quite right anymore. Why are you telling me this? Because you're thinking this was a mistake coming out here. Thinking maybe you should get on the next stage back to civilization soon as you can walk." His winter eyes fixed on her, steady and unflinching. "And maybe you're right. This country breaks people. Kills them if they're not careful, sometimes kills them even if they are, but it also makes them stronger if they're stubborn enough to survive it." "And which am I?" Evelyn asked. "Stubborn or stupid?" "Don't know yet, but you're alive, which is more than most people could say after what you just went through." He pulled his blanket tighter. "Get some sleep, Evelyn. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She wanted to argue, wanted to ask him 100 questions about the ranch and Wolf Creek and what exactly he expected from her, but exhaustion hit her like a hammer. One moment she was sitting upright, and the next she was lying down, the blanket cocooned around her, the fire's warmth finally seeping into her bones. Through half-closed eyes, she watched Silas feeding another log into the stove, his scarred hands moving with unconscious grace. "What have I gotten myself into?" she thought. But sleep dragged her under before she could find an answer. She woke to pale gray light filtering through the gaps in the shack walls and the smell of something cooking. For a confused moment, Evelyn had no idea where she was. Then memory crashed back and she sat up too quickly, her ribs protesting with sharp pain. "Easy." Silas was crouched by the stove, stirring something in a battered pot. "You cracked some ribs, probably. Gonna hurt for a while." Evelyn looked down and realized she was still wrapped in the blanket, her dress hanging near the stove, mostly dry now. Silas had his back to her, giving her privacy, and she felt a weird rush of gratitude for that small courtesy. She managed to pull her dress on, wincing at every movement, then laced her boots with fingers that finally worked properly again. "What is that?" she asked, nodding at the pot. "Rabbit stew. Trapped it last week, smoked the meat, left it here for emergencies." He ladled some into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Eat. You need something in your stomach." The stew was simple, just meat and some wild onions, but it was hot and tasted better than anything Evelyn had eaten in weeks. She finished the cup in minutes, and Silas refilled it without comment. They ate in silence while outside the storm faded to a steady drizzle. "Stage driver's probably dead," Silas said eventually. "Current that strong, if he went under weighted down by those coats they wear, he didn't come back up." Evelyn set down her cup, appetite gone. "I killed him. I told him to cross. He chose to listen. Could have refused, could have turned back. This country doesn't give you second chances, and everyone who lives here knows it." Silas poured himself more stew. "You feel guilty. That's natural. But guilt doesn't change what happened. Driver knew the risks, same as everyone else." "That's cold. That's honest." He met her eyes. "You want me to lie to you, make you feel better? I can do that. But it won't help you survive out here." Evelyn stared at him, this hard, scarred stranger who'd saved her life and was now telling her brutal truths while feeding her rabbit stew in a shack in the middle of nowhere. Part of her wanted to hate him for his bluntness. Another part, a part she didn't quite recognize, respected him for it. "Tell me about Wolf Creek," she said. "The truth. Not what you wrote in your letters." Silas leaned back against the wall, considering. "It's a settlement, not a town. Maybe 50 people on a good day, spread out over 10 miles of valley. Most of them are ranchers or miners, and most of them have reasons for being out here that don't bear too much examination. There's a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon that doubles as everything else. Church, meeting hall, post office. No real law except what we make ourselves. Winters are brutal, summers are short, and everyone who lives there is either running from something or too stubborn to know when to quit." "And you're which?" "Both, probably." He took a long drink from his cup. "My ranch is about 5 miles from the settlement, up in the high valley between Black Ridge and Wolf Creek Mountain. It's isolated, hard to reach, harder to defend. I've got maybe 200 head of cattle, some horses, chickens, if the coyotes haven't gotten them. House is solid, but not fancy. 1 bedroom, a main room with a fireplace, and a loft for storage." "1 bedroom," Evelyn repeated. "Wasn't expecting you to have your own." He paused. "But I can sleep in the loft if that's what you want. I told you in the letters I wasn't going to force anything. That still stands. The letters also said you were looking for a wife, not a boarder. I am. But there's a difference between wanting something and taking it before it's offered." Silas set down his cup. "You came out here based on letters and a promise. You got a right to see what you're signing up for before you commit to anything permanent." "That's surprisingly decent of you." Don't make me out to be noble. I'm not." His face was hard again, all the brief vulnerability gone. "I'm selfish and mean-tempered, and I've done things I'm not proud of to survive out here. But I keep my word, and I told you I'd treat you fair. That's what I'm doing." Evelyn studied him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one who'd written those letters. Words that had been rough and unpolished, but also achingly honest about loneliness, about the weight of living in silence, about wanting someone to talk to at the end of a long day. This version of Silas was harder, more guarded, like he'd already regretted showing her that much of himself. "All right," she said. "Then I want to see the ranch. I want to meet the settlement. And I want time to decide if this is really what I want before we do anything official." "Fair enough." Silas stood and started packing up the camp. "Storm's breaking. We can reach the ranch by midday if we move steady." They left the line shack behind and rode through a landscape that looked like it had been drowned and resurrected. The creek was still high, but no longer the raging monster it had been yesterday. Broken trees littered the banks. Here and there, Evelyn spotted pieces of the wagon, a wheel, some splintered boards, a soaked pillow that might have been hers. Silas didn't slow down, just kept the horse moving at a steady walk through the mud. As they climbed out of the valley, the sun finally broke through the clouds, turning the wet landscape into something unexpectedly beautiful. The pines sparkled with raindrops. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still white with snow. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, and somewhere in the distance Evelyn heard the mournful call of what might have been a wolf,
"It's not all ugly," she said quietly.
Silas glanced back at her. Never said it was. Said it was hard. Beautiful and hard aren't opposites out here. They're the same thing. They rode in silence after that, Evelyn too tired and sore to talk, Silas apparently content with quiet. The trail climbed steadily, following the creek through narrow gorges and across meadows just beginning to green up with spring growth. Once they spotted a herd of elk watching them from a hillside, massive and regal and completely unconcerned by their presence. Another time, Silas stopped abruptly and pointed to tracks in the mud, huge paw prints with claw marks that looked like they'd been made by something prehistoric. "Grizzly," he said, "came through here this morning, probably heading up to the high country. Give her space if you ever see her, and never get between her and cubs if she's got any." Evelyn stared at the tracks, each one bigger than her hand. In Boston, danger came from people. Thieves, drunks, men who thought a woman alone was an invitation. Out here, danger was something else entirely, something that didn't care about human rules or intentions. "How do you live like this?" she asked. "Always looking over your shoulder, always waiting for the next storm or an animal or disaster. You get used to it," Silas nudged the horse forward, "and eventually you realize you'd rather die out here fighting than waste away somewhere safe and soft, never knowing if you were strong enough to survive the hard thing." "That's a bleak philosophy." "It's kept me alive for 10 years. You got a better one?" Evelyn didn't answer because she didn't have one. She'd spent her whole life being careful, being proper, following rules that were supposed to protect her, but had really just kept her small and afraid. Coming out here was the first reckless thing she'd ever done, and she'd almost died for it. But she'd also felt more alive in the last 24 hours than she had in years. Even drowning in that flood, even shaking with cold in that line shack, she'd felt real in a way Boston had never allowed. The ranch appeared as they crested a ridge, a sturdy log cabin nestled in a valley between two mountain spurs, surrounded by rough pasture where cattle grazed. A barn stood nearby, weathered but solid, and there was a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a few other outbuildings Evelyn couldn't identify. It was isolated, wild, and somehow exactly what she'd imagined when reading Silas's letters. "Home," Silas said simply, and there was something in his voice, pride maybe, or just exhaustion, that made Evelyn's chest tighten. They rode down to the cabin. Silas dismounted and helped her down, his hands careful around her injured ribs. Up close, she could see that the cabin was well maintained, the logs chinked tight against weather, the roof solid. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone had been here recently, keeping a fire going. "I got a hired hand," Silas explained, seeing her confusion. "Kid named Tommy. He's out checking the herd right now, but he keeps the place running when I'm gone. He'll probably sleep in the barn while you're here. Give us privacy." He opened the door and Evelyn stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. The cabin was simple but not crude. There was a large fireplace dominating one wall, a table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. The promised bedroom was visible through an open doorway, just big enough for a bed and a trunk. The loft above was accessed by a ladder and seemed to be used for storage and additional sleeping space. "It's not much," Silas said, and for the first time he sounded uncertain. "It's more than I expected." Evelyn walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. She recognized some of the titles: Shakespeare, Dickens, a worn copy of Walden. "You read." "Gets lonely up here. Books help." He moved to the fireplace and started building up the fire. "There's a bathing room out back, just a shed with a tub and a stove to heat water. You probably want to clean up. I'll get the water heating." He left before she could respond, and Evelyn was alone in the cabin that might become her home. She moved slowly around the space, taking inventory. Everything was worn but cared for. The chairs had been repaired multiple times. The table was scarred but clean. The bed in the other room had a quilt that looked handmade, each stitch precise and careful. This wasn't the home of a man who'd given up on life. It was the home of someone who'd built something worth keeping, piece by stubborn piece. On the mantel above the fireplace, she found a photograph in a simple frame. A younger Silas standing with 2 other people, a woman and a small boy. They were all smiling, the woman's hand on the boy's shoulder, Silas's arm around her waist. The man in the photograph looked different from the one she'd just ridden with, less scarred, less hard, almost happy. "That's my wife and son." Silas had come back inside without her hearing him. His voice was flat, carefully empty. Sarah and Michael. They died 6 years ago. Evelyn turned to him. The letters didn't mention...
Yeah, well, I don't talk about it much. He set down the bucket he was carrying. Happened during a bad winter. I was out trying to save the herd when a blizzard hit. Came back to find them both frozen. Sarah had tried to keep Michael warm, wrapped him in every blanket we had, but it wasn't enough. Cold got through anyway. I'm sorry.
Don't be. It was a long time ago. But the way he said it made it clear no amount of time would ever be long enough. Water's heating. Give it 20 minutes and it should be ready. He left again, and Evelyn stood there holding the photograph, looking at the ghost of the man Silas used to be. The letters made sense now. The loneliness, the careful distance, the way he'd written about wanting companionship, but not love. He'd already loved and lost, and it had carved something vital out of him. She set the photograph back on the mantel, her own reflection ghosting across the glass. She looked like hell, hair matted, face bruised, clothes still damp and stained with mud. But her eyes were bright, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. Whatever happened next, whatever she decided about Silas and the ranch and this brutal, beautiful country, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same woman who'd climbed into that wagon in Cheyenne. That woman had drowned in Black Ridge Creek. The person standing here now was someone different, someone who'd survived. And maybe, just maybe, someone who was stubborn enough to make this work. The bathwater was scalding hot, and Evelyn didn't care. She sank into it until only her head remained above the surface, letting the heat work into muscles that felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. The bathing shed was crude, just rough planks and a tin tub. But after 2 days of mud and terror, it felt like the finest luxury Boston had ever offered. Through the gaps in the walls, she could hear voices. Silas talking to someone, probably the hired hand he'd mentioned. Their words were too muted to make out, but the tone was easy enough to read. Silas giving orders, the other voice responding with the quick agreement of someone who knew better than to argue. Evelyn scrubbed at her skin with a bar of harsh soap, watching the water turn gray with dirt. Her hands found the bruises. A massive one spreading across her ribs where something had hit her in the flood, smaller ones on her arms and legs, a tender spot on her temple she didn't remember acquiring. The physical evidence of how close she'd come to dying. In Boston, she'd gone years without so much as a scraped knee. Out here, she'd collected a catalog of injuries in less than a day. The water was cooling by the time she finally climbed out, wrapping herself in a rough towel that smelled like wood smoke. Her dress was ruined, still damp and stained beyond repair. She had nothing else to wear. Everything she'd brought west was somewhere downstream, probably torn to pieces by now. A knock on the shed door made her jump. "Got some clothes for you." Silas's voice carefully directed away from the door. "They're going to be too big, but it's better than nothing. I'll leave them here." She heard his footsteps retreat and waited a moment before cracking the door open. On the ground sat a pile of folded clothing, a man's work shirt, a pair of canvas pants, and what looked like suspenders. The shirt had been worn soft with age, and when she held it up, she could smell Silas on it, a scent that was part sweat, part pine, part something she couldn't identify, but that made her feel oddly safe. Getting into the clothes was an adventure. The shirt hung on her like a tent. The pants required rolling up at the ankles and cinching tight with the suspenders. And she had to use a piece of rope she found hanging on a nail to keep the whole ensemble from falling off. When she finally emerged from the shed, she felt ridiculous. A child playing dress-up in adult clothing. Silas took one look at her and something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe, or just surprise. A younger man stood beside him, barely 20, with sandy hair and a nervous energy that reminded Evelyn of a spooked horse. "This is Tommy," Silas said. "Tommy, this is Miss Carter." "Ma'am?" Tommy ducked his head, his face flushing red. "Heard you had some trouble at the crossing." "That's one way to put it." Evelyn tried to adjust the shirt, which kept sliding off one shoulder. "Thank you for keeping the fire going. The cabin was warm when we arrived." "Yes, ma'am. That's my job, ma'am." Tommy looked at Silas like he was waiting for permission to breathe. "Should I move my things to the barn now, boss?" "Yeah, and check the north fence line tomorrow. Thought I saw some damage when we rode in." Tommy nodded and practically ran toward the barn, clearly relieved to have a task that took him away from the awkwardness of meeting Silas's mail-order bride. Evelyn watched him go, then turned to Silas. "He's terrified of you." "He's terrified of everything. Kid showed up here 2 years ago, half-starved and running from something he won't talk about. I gave him work and a place to sleep. He's loyal, works hard, and doesn't ask questions. That's all I need. You collect strays then?"
Silas's mouth twitched. "Apparently." He gestured toward the cabin. "You should eat something real. I've got elk steaks and potatoes. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." The meal was exactly as advertised, simple, filling, and better than it had any right to be. Silas cooked with the same efficient competence he seemed to bring to everything else, moving around the small kitchen like he'd done it 1,000 times. Which, Evelyn supposed, he had. 6 years of cooking for one, eating alone, cleaning up alone. The loneliness of it hit her harder than she expected. "How often do you go into Wolf Creek?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them while they ate. "Once a month for supplies. More if something breaks that I can't fix myself." Silas cut into his steak, the knife scraping against the tin plate. "Sometimes less in winter if the pass is snowed in." "And you don't get lonely? All the way out here by yourself?"
"Didn't say that," he chewed thoughtfully. "Lonely's just part of it, same as cold or danger or anything else. You learn to live with it." "Is that why you sent for me? To have someone around?" Silas set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I sent for you because I'm tired of eating alone. Tired of talking to myself and the horses. Tired of going weeks without hearing another human voice except Tommy's stuttering. I'm not good at being alone, turns out. Thought I was, after Sarah died. Thought maybe I preferred it. But 6 years is a long time to realize you were wrong." The honesty of it stole Evelyn's breath. She'd expected him to dodge the question or give her some practical answer about needing help with the ranch. Instead, he'd handed her the raw truth, and it sat between them like something fragile and dangerous. "I'm not her," Evelyn said quietly. "Your wife. I won't be her. Don't want you to be. She was soft, kind. She loved this place because she loved me, not because she belonged here. I knew it when I brought her out, knew she was too gentle for the frontier, but I was selfish and young and thought love would be enough." His voice went flat again, that careful emptiness. "It wasn't. And I won't make that mistake twice. What makes you think I'm any different? I'm a school teacher from Boston. I'm about as frontier as a teacup. You told the stage driver to cross a flooded creek in a storm. That's not soft. That's stubborn." Silas picked up his fork again. "Stubborn survives out here. Soft just dies slower." They finished eating in silence, and Evelyn helped clean up despite Silas telling her she didn't need to. Her ribs screamed with every movement, but she refused to sit idle while he worked. When the dishes were done and put away, the fire banked for the night. Silas showed her to the bedroom. "You take this. I'll sleep in the loft like I said." Evelyn looked at the bed, the quilt Sarah had probably made, the pillow Silas had been using for 6 years alone. "This feels wrong. You're injured and exhausted. You need a real bed." He was already heading for the ladder. "We can argue about it tomorrow if you want, but tonight you're sleeping there and that's final." He climbed up to the loft before she could protest, and Evelyn was left alone in the bedroom with a dead woman's quilt and more questions than answers. She crawled under the covers, her body aching, her mind spinning. Through the floorboards above, she could hear Silas moving around, settling in. Then silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the distant howl of wind through the valley. Sleep took her quickly, but it wasn't peaceful. She dreamed of drowning, of cold water filling her lungs, of Silas's scarred hands reaching for her, but always just out of reach. The next morning arrived too early, announced by a rooster's crow that sounded like it was directly outside the window. Evelyn groaned and pulled the quilt over her head, but the damage was done. She was awake, her ribs throbbing, her whole body stiff as a board. She heard movement in the main room, the clatter of the stove being fed, the smell of coffee beginning to permeate the cabin. When she finally dragged herself out of bed, still wearing Silas's oversized clothes, she found him at the table with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs. He looked like he'd been awake for hours. "There's more in the pan," he said without looking up from whatever he was reading, a newspaper that looked weeks old. "Coffee's hot." Evelyn poured herself a cup and took the chair across from him. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but after the first bitter sip, she found she liked it. It tasted honest, like everything else about this place. "I need to go into Wolf Creek today," Silas said, folding the newspaper. "Let people know you're here Explain about the stage driver, see if anyone found wreckage or remains downstream. You should come. Folks will want to meet you. In these clothes? Better than naked. He almost smiled. Besides, nobody in Wolf Creek gives a damn what you wear. Half the women there dress like men anyway. Easier for working. And the other half? Judge everyone else for doing it, then do it themselves when nobody's looking. Silas stood and brought his plate to the basin. We'll leave in an hour. Gives you time to wake up proper. The ride into Wolf Creek took them down out of the high valley and along a rutted trail that followed the creek for which the settlement was named. Tommy had stayed behind to work on the fence line, leaving Evelyn and Silas alone again. She was getting used to the rhythm of riding with him, the way his body moved with the horse, the solid presence of him at her back. The settlement, when it finally appeared, was exactly as Silas had described. Barely a town at all, just a loose collection of buildings scattered along both sides of a muddy main street. The general store was the largest structure, a two-story affair with a false front trying to make it look more impressive than it was. Next to it squatted a blacksmith shop, smoke rising from the forge. Across the street, a building with a hand-painted sign reading Wolf Creek Saloon served as the obvious social center. Several horses were tied out front despite the early hour. Silas guided his horse to the general store and dismounted, then helped Evelyn down. Her ribs protested, and she must have winced because his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary. You all right? Fine, just sore. That'll last a week or more. Had cracked ribs before. They're stubborn about healing. He tied the horse to the rail. Store's run by a woman named Margaret Wells. She'll talk your ear off if you let her, but she's fair with prices and doesn't gossip more than everyone else. The inside of the store was dim and crowded, every available surface covered with goods, canned foods, bolts of fabric, tools, medicine bottles, ammunition, bags of flour, and sugar. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked to be in her 50s, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, wearing a canvas apron over a practical dress. Silas Boone. Her voice carried the weight of authority. Haven't seen you in 3 weeks. Thought maybe you finally froze to death up in that valley. Not yet, Margaret. Silas removed his hat. This is Evelyn Carter, the woman I told you about in my last letter. Margaret's sharp eyes fixed on Evelyn, and the assessment was immediate and thorough, taking in the oversized clothes, the bruises visible on her face and hands, the way she held herself like someone who'd recently been through hell. The mail-order bride. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite friendly. Heard the stage had trouble at Black Ridge Crossing. Figured you'd gone back to wherever you came from. I went into the creek instead, Evelyn said, meeting Margaret's gaze. Silas pulled me out. Margaret's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her eyes, respect maybe, or just a recalculation of assumptions. Lost everything, I'd imagine. Everything. Well, you'll need clothes then. Can't go around wearing Silas's cast-offs, though I'll admit you wear them better than he does. Margaret came around the counter, already moving toward a section of the store stacked with fabric and ready-made garments. What size are you? And don't lie, I can eyeball it better than you can. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret outfitted Evelyn with a practical wardrobe, 2 dresses suitable for ranch work, a split riding skirt, several shirts, undergarments, a warm coat, and a pair of boots that actually fit. The cost made Evelyn's head spin, but Silas paid without flinching, adding supplies for the ranch to the pile. Put it on my account, he told Margaret. Your account's already got a balance, Silas. Then add more to it. I'll settle up after the cattle sale in fall. Margaret snorted, but wrote it down in her ledger. You say that every year, and every year you actually pay it off. Most honest man in the territory, which is probably why everyone thinks you're crazy. Other customers had drifted into the store while they shopped, and Evelyn felt their eyes on her, curious, judgmental, measuring. A woman in an expensive dress that looked absurd in the rough settlement whispered to her companion behind a gloved hand. 2 ranchers by the tool section made no effort to hide their staring. A teenage girl restocking shelves watched Evelyn with something that looked like pity. Don't mind them, Margaret said, her voice lower. Everyone here's got nothing better to do than gossip about newcomers. Give them a week, and they'll find someone else to talk about. Unless I give them something to talk about first, Evelyn said. Well, you already survived a flood and showed up wearing men's clothes. I'd say you're doing a fine job. Margaret wrapped the purchases in brown paper and twine. You need anything else, you come see me. And don't let these people run you off. Most of them wouldn't last a day in a real city, but they act like frontier living makes them special. It was the first genuinely kind thing anyone besides Silas had said to Evelyn since she'd arrived, and it hit harder than expected. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice, and followed Silas out of the store with her packages. See, Silas said as they loaded the supplies onto the horse. Could have been worse. Could have been Martha Harrison in there instead of Margaret. Martha would have called you a harlot and tried to save your soul in the same breath.
Is that the woman in the expensive dress? That's her. Her husband runs the largest ranch in the valley besides mine. She's convinced she's frontier royalty because she came out here with servants and a piano. Silas secured the last bundle. She'll try to befriend you eventually, either to get information about me or to have someone to lord over. Avoid her if you can.
Silas Boone! A man's voice, loud and jovial, cut through the morning air. Heard you fished a drowned woman out of Black Ridge. That her? A group had emerged from the saloon. 3 men, all weathered and rough, clearly starting their drinking early. The one who'd spoken was tall and rangy, with a beard that looked like it hadn't seen scissors in months. His companions flanked him with the casual readiness of men used to backing each other up in fights. That's her, Silas said, his voice gone flat. Evelyn, this is Jack Crawford. He runs a mining claim up in the North Ridge. Pleasure, ma'am. Jack's grin showed missing teeth. Heard the stage driver didn't make it. That true? We haven't found him yet, Silas said before Evelyn could answer. You got men working near the lower creek. You might keep an eye out. Might do that. Might also wonder why a woman had come all the way from, where was it, Boston? To marry a man who couldn't keep his first family alive through a winter. The words hung in the air like poison. Evelyn felt Silas go rigid beside her, and she saw his hand drift toward his belt where a knife hung in a worn sheath. The men behind Jack spread out slightly, and the street that had been busy moments before suddenly felt very empty.
Jack, Silas said quietly, you got something to say. Say it clear. Just curious is all. Curious why a woman would pick you when she could have stayed safe in the city, unless maybe she's running from something worse. Jack's eyes slid to Evelyn, assessing and mean. What'd you do, sweetheart? Steal something? Kill someone? Or just couldn't find a man willing to marry you proper? Evelyn stepped forward before she could think better of it. I came here because I chose to, because your frontier isn't half as frightening as men who think they're clever for being cruel. I've dealt with bullies before, Mr. Crawford. They're the same everywhere. All mouth, no substance. Jack's grin faltered. One of his companions laughed, then tried to cover it with a cough. Silas hadn't moved, but Evelyn could feel the violence coiled in him, ready to spring. Got yourself a mouthy one, Boone, Jack said, but the swagger had leaked out of his voice. Hope she survives longer than the last one. Get out of my sight, Silas said, before I put you in it permanent. Jack held his ground for another heartbeat, then spat in the dirt and turned back toward the saloon, his companions following. But Evelyn could feel the weight of his stare on her back as Silas helped her onto the horse. They were halfway out of town before Silas spoke. Shouldn't have done that. Defended you? Made an enemy on your first day. Jack's not someone you want noticing you. He already noticed me. At least now he knows I'm not afraid of him. You should be, Silas said. He killed a man 2 years ago in a claim dispute. Shot him in the back. Everyone knows it, but there's no law out here to do anything about it. Jack does what he wants, and people stay out of his way. Evelyn absorbed that, feeling the first real flutter of fear since climbing out of the flood. Will he come after us? Maybe. Or maybe he'll just talk trash and drink himself stupid like he usually does. Silas urged the horse faster. Either way, you stay away from him. He's the kind of man who hurts people because he can, and he's got a special meanness for women. They rode in silence after that, but Evelyn's mind was racing. She'd known the frontier would be hard. Silas's letters had made that clear enough. But she hadn't understood what that meant beyond weather and isolation. This was a different kind of hard, the kind that came from people without laws or consequences. From men like Jack Crawford, who saw violence as entertainment. Back at the ranch, Tommy was waiting by the barn, his face pale. Boss, we got problems. What kind? Silas dismounted quickly, already moving toward whatever crisis had developed. North fence is cut. Clean cuts. not weather damage, and I'm missing 6 head from the high pasture. Evelyn watched Silas's expression darken. When? Had to be last night. I checked that fence yesterday afternoon and it was fine. Rustlers, Silas said, and it wasn't a question. He turned to Evelyn. Get inside, stay there till I get back. Where are you going? To track whoever took my cattle and have a conversation with them about property rights. He was already saddling a fresh horse, his movements sharp with anger. Tommy, you stay here with Miss Carter. Anyone comes around who isn't me, you shoot first and ask questions after. Boss, that's an order. Silas swung into the saddle. To Evelyn, I mean it. Stay inside, lock the door. There's a rifle above the mantel, and it's loaded. He rode off before she could protest, leaving Evelyn standing in the yard with Tommy, who looked like he was about to be sick. Does this happen often? She asked. Rustling? Sometimes. Usually it's just opportunistic. Someone sees unguarded cattle and figures Silas won't notice a few missing. But cutting fences... Tommy shook his head. That's different. That's deliberate. Jack Crawford. Evelyn said it as a statement. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She turned toward the cabin. Come on. If we're stuck here waiting, we might as well make something useful of it. You know how to cook? Tommy followed her inside, clearly baffled by the question. Some, mostly beans and bacon. Then I'll teach you something better. If I'm going to be here, I might as well earn my keep. They spent the afternoon in the cabin's small kitchen, Evelyn teaching Tommy how to make bread while they waited for Silas to return. It gave her something to do besides worry, and Tommy slowly relaxed as they worked, his stutter fading as he got caught up in learning. He told her about the ranch, about how Silas had found him half dead from exposure and nursed him back to health, about the long winters when snow buried everything and days would pass without seeing another soul. Boss is hard, Tommy said, kneading dough with increasing confidence. But he's fair. Saved my life when he had no reason to. Could have just left me in that snowbank, but he didn't. What were you running from? Tommy's hands stilled. Same thing everyone out here's running from. A past that didn't fit anymore. Evelyn understood that better than she wanted to admit. She'd been running too, from loneliness, from the suffocating expectations of Boston society, from the growing certainty that if she didn't leave, she'd turn into one of those dried-up spinster teachers who haunted the school halls like bitter ghosts. Coming west hadn't been brave. It had been desperate. The bread was rising when they heard hooves outside. Tommy grabbed the rifle before Evelyn could, positioning himself between her and the door with a determination that surprised her. But it was Silas who came through, covered in dust and looking murderous. Found them, he said without preamble. 3 men camped in the canyon west of here. Had my cattle with them, plus stock from 2 other ranches. Shot at me when I approached, so I shot back. Did you kill them? Evelyn asked, and she was alarmed by how calm her voice sounded. 1. The other 2 ran. Silas pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, and Evelyn saw his knuckles were bloodied. Left the body there. Tomorrow I'll ride into Wolf Creek and report it, see if anyone claims him. Probably nobody will. And the cattle? Drove them back to the high pasture. Tommy, you'll need to fix that fence tonight. I don't want any more losses. Yes, boss. Tommy set down the rifle and headed for the door, relief written all over his face at having a concrete task. When they were alone, Evelyn watched Silas pour himself water from the bucket and drink it down in long gulps. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline wearing off, she guessed, the aftermath of violence catching up to him. You killed a man today, she said. I did. Do you feel bad about it? Silas set down the cup and looked at her directly. No. He was stealing from me. He shot at me first, and he would have killed me if I'd given him the chance. That's how it works out here. You hesitate, you die. I learned that a long time ago. And if I can't live with that, with knowing you're the kind of man who kills when necessary, then you get on the next stage east and go back to a place where the law handles things for you. His voice was harsh, but underneath it, Evelyn heard exhaustion and something that might have been fear. I told you this country was hard. I told you it would test you. If you're looking for soft and safe, you're in the wrong place with the wrong man. Evelyn moved to the stove and pulled out the risen bread, sliding it into the oven with hands that were steadier than they should have been. I'm not looking for soft. If I was, I would never have answered your first letter. Then what are you looking for? She turned to face him. Honest. I want honest, even when it's ugly. I want someone who won't lie to me about what this life costs. And I want to know that if something comes for us, weather or rustlers, or just the grinding weight of isolation, you won't fold. That you're as stubborn about surviving as you said I was.
Silas studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. I can give you honest. Everything else... He trailed off, then seemed to decide something. Come with me. Want to show you something. He led her outside as the sun was starting to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. They walked past the barn, up a small rise behind the cabin, to a spot where 2 wooden crosses stood beneath a pine tree. The graves were well maintained, the grass trimmed, a few wildflowers growing at the bases of the crosses. Sarah and Michael, Silas said quietly. I buried them here so they'd always be close, so I could talk to them when I needed to. He stood with his hat in his hands, his scarred face shadowed. First year after they died, I came up here every day, sometimes twice. Told them everything, about the ranch, the weather, the stupid things the horses did. Talked until my voice gave out. Evelyn stayed silent, letting him speak. Second year, it was every few days. Third year, maybe once a week. Now, he shook his head. Now it's when I've got something important to say. When I'm making a decision they should be part of. Like sending for a mail-order bride? Yeah, like that. He turned to look at her. I asked Sarah if she thought I was ready, if 6 years was long enough, and I swear I heard her laugh and tell me not to be an idiot, that no amount of time would ever be enough, but that didn't mean I should die alone. What did you tell her about me? That you were stubborn and brave and probably too good for this place, but that I was going to try anyway. That I'd do my best to keep you alive and as happy as someone could be in a hard place. He looked back at the graves. And that if I failed with you, like I failed with her, it would probably kill me. The vulnerability in his voice cracked something open in Evelyn's chest. She stepped closer, close enough to touch him, though she didn't. You didn't fail her, Silas. The winter did. The isolation did. The fact that this place doesn't forgive mistakes or weakness. But you didn't fail. Tell that to the graves. I'm telling it to you. She paused, gathering courage. And I'm telling you that I'm not planning to die on you. I'm planning to be just as stubborn about surviving as you are. So if you're done trying to scare me off, we can move forward with figuring out how this works. Silas finally looked at her fully, and in the dying light, his winter eyes seemed almost warm. You sure? Because once you commit to this, it's not easy to undo. Wolf Creek doesn't have judges or divorce lawyers. Marriage out here is what you make it, and it lasts until death or distance pulls it apart. I'm sure. In saying it, Evelyn realized it was true. She was terrified, exhausted, in pain, and completely out of her depth. But she was also more alive than she'd been in years. When? Week. Maybe 2. Need to give people time to know you're here so they don't think I just dragged you off and forced you. He turned back toward the cabin. And you need time to change your mind if you're going to. I won't. We'll see. They walked back down the hill together as darkness settled over the valley. Inside the cabin, the bread had finished baking, filling the space with a smell that was warm and domestic and completely at odds with the violence of the day. Tommy came in from fixing the fence, his hands covered in wood splinters, and the 3 of them ate dinner together in companionable silence. Later, after Tommy had gone to the barn and Silas had climbed to the loft, Evelyn lay in the bedroom staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the frontier night, wind through the pines, the distant howl of wolves, cattle lowing in the pasture. She thought about the graves on the hill, about Jack Crawford's mean eyes, about the man Silas had killed that afternoon and the cattle that were now back where they belonged. This was her life now. Violence and beauty tangled together, danger lurking in every shadow, survival depending on being hard enough to match the country. Boston felt like a dream she'd had years ago, something soft and distant and ultimately irrelevant. She'd meant what she told Silas. She wasn't planning to die here. She was planning to live here in all the messy, brutal, honest ways that required. And if that meant learning to shoot, to ride through blizzards, to stand up to men like Jack Crawford without flinching, then that's what she'd do. The frontier had tried to kill her once. It wouldn't get a second chance. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, which gave Evelyn exactly 3 weeks to learn everything she should have known before agreeing to marry a mountain rancher. Silas proved to be a ruthless teacher, waking her before dawn every morning and working her until her hands bled and her muscles screamed.
"City softness will kill you faster than anything else out here," he said, on the third morning, watching her struggle to saddle his mare without help. "Winter comes early in the high country. You need to be ready." "I'm trying," Evelyn snapped, fighting with a cinch that refused to cooperate. Her fingers were raw from learning to split wood the day before, and her shoulders ached from hauling water from the creek.
"Maybe if you actually helped instead of just standing there criticizing. When I'm not here and something needs doing, there won't be anyone to help. So you learn now, or you don't learn at all." He turned away, dismissing her frustration. "Finish that and meet me at the north pasture. We're moving cattle today." He walked off before she could respond, leaving her alone with the horse and her rising anger. The mare, sensing Evelyn's inexperience, kept shifting sideways every time she tried to tighten the cinch. By the time she finally got the saddle secured properly, Evelyn was close to tears, not from sadness, but from pure frustrated rage at her own incompetence. Tommy found her in the barn afterward, sitting on a hay bale with her face in her hands. "He's hard on you," Tommy said quietly, settling nearby. "Harder than he was on me when I started." "Because he expects me to fail." Evelyn looked up, her eyes dry but burning. "He thinks I'll run at the first real test."
"Maybe. Or maybe he's scared you will, so he's testing you now while there's still time for you to leave without it killing you both." Tommy picked at a piece of straw. "He loved Miss Sarah something fierce. When she died, it broke him in ways he still hasn't fixed. I think he's terrified of it happening again. So he's trying to drive me away first."
"Or trying to make you strong enough to survive?" "Could be both." Tommy stood, brushing hay off his pants. "Either way, you're doing better than you think. Most city folk wouldn't last 3 days of what he's putting you through. You're on week 2 and still swinging." The observation helped, marginally. Evelyn pulled herself together and rode out to meet Silas at the north pasture, where he and Tommy spent the rest of the day teaching her how to move cattle, how to read the herd, how to position her horse, how to use her voice and posture to guide animals that outweighed her 10 times over. She fell off twice, got kicked once, and nearly got trampled when a steer decided to charge instead of following the herd. Silas pulled her out of the way at the last second, his arm an iron bar across her chest, his voice sharp in her ear. "Watch their heads. They'll tell you what they're planning before they do it." That night, soaking her bruises in the tin tub, Evelyn seriously considered Tommy's suggestion that Silas was trying to break her. But something stubborn in her core refused to give him the satisfaction. She'd survived drowning and murder attempts, and Jack Crawford's mean eyes. She could survive Silas Boone's training regimen. The weeks blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and learning. Silas taught her to shoot, to track, to read weather, in the clouds and wind. He showed her which plants were edible and which would kill her, how to dress a deer, how to render fat for candles and soap. Margaret Wells contributed too, teaching Evelyn the social dynamics of Wolf Creek, who to trust, who to avoid, how to navigate the complex web of alliances and grudges that governed frontier life. "Martha Harrison's already spreading rumors about you," Margaret said one afternoon while Evelyn helped reorganize inventory in the store. "Says you're probably a criminal running from the law, that Silas only took you because no decent woman would have him." "Let her talk." Evelyn counted cans of peaches, making marks in Margaret's ledger. "I've got better things to worry about." "That's the right attitude. But be warned, Martha's got influence. Her husband's rich by frontier standards, and she uses it to get what she wants. If she decides she doesn't like you, she'll make life difficult." "More difficult than learning to move cattle while my ribs are still healing? More difficult than splitting wood until my hands bleed?" Evelyn set down the last can. "Martha Harrison doesn't scare me." Margaret smiled, and it was genuine. "You're tougher than you look. Silas chose better than I expected." But Margaret's warning proved prescient. 2 days before the wedding, Martha Harrison showed up at the ranch in a buggy driven by a servant, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Silas made in 6 months. Evelyn was in the yard teaching herself to throw an axe at a target Silas had set up, missing more often than hitting, when the buggy rolled up. "Miss Carter," Martha's voice dripped false sweetness. "How industrious of you! Though I must say, axe throwing seems an odd skill for a bride to cultivate." Evelyn wiped sweat from her forehead and faced the woman.
Up close, Martha was pretty in a hard sort of way, all sharp edges and calculating eyes, the kind of beauty that came from money and maintenance rather than genetics. Mrs. Harrison, what brings you out here? I wanted to meet you properly before the wedding. Welcome you to our little community. Martha stepped down from the buggy with practiced grace, her servant immediately offering a hand she didn't need. I understand you're from Boston. How delightful. We so rarely get educated women out here. The emphasis on educated carried implications that Evelyn chose to ignore. It's different from the city, certainly, but I'm adapting. Yes, I can see that. Martha's gaze traveled over Evelyn's work clothes, men's pants and a worn shirt, both stained with sweat and dirt. Though I hope you'll allow me to offer some guidance on proper frontier society. There are standards, you understand, ways things are done. Just because we're isolated doesn't mean we need to become savages. I appreciate the offer, Evelyn said carefully, but Silas has been an excellent teacher. Silas! Martha's mouth twisted. Yes, well, Silas knows ranching, but social graces? The man barely speaks in town, and he lives like a hermit up here. You'll need guidance from someone who understands civilization, even in this rough place. Before Evelyn could respond, Silas emerged from the barn, his expression darkening the moment he saw Martha. Mrs. Harrison, you're a long way from your ranch. Mr. Boone, I was just offering to help Miss Carter adjust to Wolf Creek Society. A woman alone in these parts needs female companionship and guidance. Evelyn's doing fine without interference. Silas moved to stand beside Evelyn, a subtle claiming of territory. And she won't be alone after Saturday. Yes, the wedding. How romantic. Martha's smile was all teeth. Though I must say the whole settlement is curious about the arrangement. Mail-order brides are so transactional. One wonders what desperation drives a woman to such measures. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn felt Silas tense beside her, but she spoke before he could. The same desperation that drives people to leave comfortable cities for a frontier where men shoot each other over cattle and women measure their worth by how much their husbands are worth. We're all desperate out here, Mrs. Harrison. I'm just honest about it. Martha's smile froze. For a moment, her mask slipped, and Evelyn saw real anger underneath. The fury of a woman who'd built her identity on being better than everyone around her and just been told she wasn't special. Then the mask snapped back into place. How refreshingly direct. I can see you'll fit right in. Martha returned to her buggy. Do call on me after you're settled, Miss Carter. I'd hate for you to feel isolated up here. The buggy rolled away, leaving dust and tension in its wake. Silas let out a long breath. You just made an enemy of the most vindictive woman in Wolf Creek. I already had enemies. What's one more? Evelyn picked up the axe again. Besides, she started it. Doesn't matter who started it. Martha's got money and connections. She can make things hard for us. Delayed supplies, spread rumors, turn people against us when we need help. Then we'll manage without help. We've been doing fine so far. Evelyn threw the axe. It actually stuck this time, quivering in the target. I'm not going to bow and scrape to that woman just because she has money. I've met 100 Martha Harrisons in Boston, and they're all the same, cruel because they're bored, petty because they're empty inside. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Sarah used to try to befriend Martha. Thought if she was nice enough, Martha would accept her. It never worked. Martha just used the friendship to make Sarah feel worse about herself. I'm not Sarah. No, Silas agreed. You're not. Sarah was kind where you're sharp, gentle where you're hard. Maybe that's what this place needs. He picked up the other axe. Show me that throw again. Your form's off. They spent the rest of the afternoon practicing together, and for the first time since arriving, Evelyn felt like they were partners instead of teacher and failing student. Silas corrected her stance with patient hands, showed her how to let the weight of the axe do the work, praised her when she finally managed 3 good throws in a row. By evening, her shoulders were burning, but she was consistently hitting the target. You'll do, Silas said, which was the closest thing to a compliment she'd gotten from him in weeks. Tomorrow we ride to the high country. There's something you need to see before we get married. The ride took most of the morning, climbing up through pine forests and across meadows already touched by autumn gold. Silas led them to a ridge that looked out over the entire valley. Wolf Creek settlement barely visible in the distance. Their ranch a small cluster of buildings far below, mountains rising on all sides like walls holding back the rest of the world.
"This is why I stay," Silas said, dismounting. "Why I fought to keep this place after Sarah died. Because up here, none of it matters. Not Martha Harrison's money, not Jack Crawford's meanness, not the loneliness or the cold or how hard everything is. Up here, it's just beautiful and honest and exactly what it is."
Evelyn stood beside him, looking out over their valley. The wind was cold, carrying hints of the winter to come. But the view stole her breath. Endless sky, ancient mountains, wilderness that had existed long before humans arrived and would exist long after they were gone.
"I want you to know this place," Silas continued. "Want you to understand why I ask you to stay here, to fight through the hard parts. Because if you can't love this valley the way I do, then we're starting from different places, and that won't work." "I already love it," Evelyn said, and realized it was true. Not the comfortable love of familiar things, but the fierce love of something that demanded everything and gave nothing easily. "It terrifies me, but I love it."
Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "Then maybe we'll be all right." They rode back down as afternoon shadows lengthened, and Evelyn thought about the wedding in 2 days, about standing in front of the settlement and promising her life to this hard man in this harder place. Part of her was still terrified, but a larger part was ready. The wedding morning arrived cold and clear, the first real bite of winter in the air. Evelyn dressed in the one nice thing she'd bought from Margaret, a simple blue dress that was practical enough for ranch life but special enough for a wedding. She'd spent the night before altering it to fit properly, her stitches crude but serviceable. Margaret had loaned her a veil that had belonged to her daughter, yellowed with age but clean and carefully preserved. Tommy drove her into Wolf Creek in the wagon while Silas rode ahead, tradition demanding they arrive separately, even though everyone knew they'd been living on the same ranch for weeks. The settlement was more crowded than Evelyn had ever seen it, people coming in from surrounding ranches and claims, drawn by curiosity as much as celebration. Margaret met her at the store, fussing over the veil and dress like a mother hen. "You look beautiful, dear. Very frontier appropriate." "That's the nicest way anyone's ever told me I look plain," Evelyn said, but she was smiling. "Plain is what survives out here. Beautiful freezes in the first blizzard." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You ready for this? Last chance to run." "I'm ready." The ceremony took place in the saloon, which had been hastily cleaned and decorated with whatever greenery people could find. A traveling preacher happened to be passing through, lucky timing that Evelyn suspected Silas had arranged weeks ago. The man was ancient, weathered like old leather, and he conducted the ceremony with brisk efficiency. Silas stood at the front in clothes Evelyn had never seen him wear: clean pants, a pressed shirt, a jacket that looked uncomfortable on his broad frame. He'd shaved, revealing more of the scars that marked his face, and his hair was slicked back with what might have been oil or just water. He looked terrified and determined in equal measure. Evelyn walked down the makeshift aisle alone. No father to give her away, no family watching. But Margaret was there, and Tommy, and even some of the ranchers who'd stared at her in the store weeks ago. Not everyone was friendly. Martha Harrison sat in the back with a smile that promised trouble, and Jack Crawford lurked by the bar with his companions. But enough people had shown up that it felt real. When she reached Silas, he took her hand and his fingers were shaking slightly. She squeezed back, a silent message. "We're doing this together." The preacher's words blurred together, traditional phrases about duty and commitment and permanence that felt both outdated and exactly right for a frontier wedding. When he asked if Silas would take Evelyn as his wife, there was a long pause, long enough that people started shifting uncomfortably. Then Silas said, "I will," his voice rough but certain. Evelyn's own vows came easier. "I will. Then by the authority granted me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Silas leaned down, and their first kiss was brief and awkward, neither of them quite sure how to navigate this intimacy in front of an audience. But when they pulled apart, something had shifted. They were married now. Whatever came next, they'd face it as partners. The celebration afterward was loud and chaotic, people drinking and talking and offering advice that ranged from helpful to obscene. Someone produced a fiddle and started playing, and couples took turns dancing in the cramped space. Silas pulled Evelyn into an approximation of a dance, both of them terrible at it, laughing despite themselves.
This is not what I expected, Evelyn said, trying to follow his lead and failing. What did you expect? Something more dignified, more proper. This is frontier proper. We make do with what we have. He spun her, almost colliding with another couple. Having regrets yet? Ask me tomorrow when I'm nursing bruises from your terrible dancing. They stayed until evening, accepting congratulations and enduring jokes and drinking just enough to feel warm and loose. But as the sun started setting, Silas caught Evelyn's eye and nodded toward the door. They slipped out while people were distracted by another round of drinks, climbing into the wagon where Tommy was waiting. Congratulations, boss, ma'am. Tommy clicked the reins, starting them home. There's a surprise waiting when you get back. What kind of surprise? Silas asked, immediately suspicious. The good kind. Margaret arranged it, said every bride deserves something special on her wedding night. When they arrived at the ranch, candles were lit throughout the cabin, casting warm light through the windows. Someone, probably Margaret with Tommy's help, had cleaned everything until it shone, arranged wildflowers in jars on the table, and left a meal warming by the fire. There was even a bottle of what looked like expensive whiskey, a luxury in Wolf Creek. She's a meddler, Silas said, but his voice was fond. Kind of her, though. Tommy unhitched the wagon and disappeared toward the barn with obvious haste, leaving them alone in the candlelit cabin. The intimacy of it hit Evelyn suddenly. This was her wedding night. She was married to a man she'd known for less than a month, and despite all their time together, this felt completely new and frightening. You're scared, Silas observed, hanging up his jacket. Terrified. Me too. He poured 2 glasses of the whiskey and handed her one. So here's what we do. We eat Margaret's food, we drink some of this, and we talk. Just talk like we've been doing. And whatever happens after that, we figure it out together. No expectations, no pressure, just us being honest with each other. The relief that flooded through Evelyn was almost painful. That sounds perfect. They ate and drank and talked deep into the night, the conversation ranging from the ridiculous to the profound. Silas told her stories about the early days of the ranch, about mistakes he'd made and lessons he'd learned the hard way. Evelyn talked about Boston, about her parents who died when she was young, about the loneliness of being a woman without family in a city that had no place for her. I wasn't running from anything terrible, she admitted, just from the slow death of becoming invisible, of waking up at 40 and realizing my life had happened to me instead of me living it. That's as good a reason as any to come west, Silas said. Most people out here are running from something. At least you're honest about it. Somewhere during the conversation, they moved from the table to the hearth, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. The whiskey made everything softer, easier. When Silas finally kissed her again, properly this time, without an audience, it felt natural instead of awkward. And when they eventually moved to the bedroom, it was with the careful tenderness of 2 people learning each other, making promises with touch that words couldn't capture. Later, lying in the dark with Silas's arm around her waist, Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here. The flood, the fear, the brutal weeks of training, the wedding in a saloon. It was nothing like what she'd imagined when she first read Silas's letter. It was harder and stranger and somehow more right than any fantasy she'd constructed. You awake? Silas's voice was quiet in the darkness. Yes. Thank you for staying, for being stubborn enough to make this work. Thank you for pulling me out of that creek, for teaching me how to survive here. We're not done yet. Winter's coming, and it'll be the real test. Everything so far has been preparation. I know. Evelyn turned to face him, their faces inches apart in the dark. But we'll handle it together, whatever comes. Together, Silas agreed, and there was something in his voice, hope maybe, or just exhaustion, that made Evelyn hold him tighter. They fell asleep like that, tangled together against the coming cold. 3 days after the wedding, the first snow fell. It wasn't the blizzard that would come later, just a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning, and Silas took it seriously. He pushed them harder, working dawn to dusk to prepare the ranch for winter, reinforcing the barn, stacking firewood, moving cattle to lower pastures, checking every fence and building for weakness. Winter here isn't like Boston winters, he told Evelyn one evening, both of them exhausted from hauling wood. It's not something you endure. It's something you fight. Every day, every hour. You stop fighting, you die. You've mentioned that, Evelyn stacked another log. Several times. Because I need you to understand. I've seen people freeze to death 20 feet from their own door because they got disoriented in a whiteout. I've seen cattle die standing up, frozen solid where they stood. Winter up here doesn't care how tough you are or how prepared you think you are. It just kills. Then we'll be tougher than winter. We'll be more prepared than it expects. Evelyn straightened, her back aching. You keep warning me like I'm going to break. I'm not going to break, Silas. I'm going to survive this, and so are you, and so is this ranch. So can we please just focus on the work instead of you trying to scare me? Silas stared at her, then laughed, an actual laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? Count on it. But Silas's warnings proved prophetic. The light snow was followed by heavier falls, and by mid-October the high country was buried under a foot of white. They brought the cattle down from the upper pastures just in time, driving them through snow that was already knee-deep on the horses. Evelyn learned to work in layers of clothing, to wrap her face against windburn, to keep moving even when exhaustion made her want to stop. The settlement was preparing too. Every time they rode into Wolf Creek for supplies, there was a sense of urgency in the air, people stocking up, fortifying buildings, making sure they had enough of everything to last until spring. Margaret warned them that it was shaping up to be a hard winter, the worst in several years according to the old-timers. Stock up more than you think you need, she advised, helping Evelyn load supplies into the wagon. If you get snowed in for weeks, you'll be glad you have extra. They took her advice, buying more than Silas thought necessary, straining his credit with Margaret, but ensuring they'd have reserves. On the way back to the ranch, Evelyn noticed storm clouds building to the north, massive, dark, and moving fast. That doesn't look good, she said. Silas followed her gaze and swore. That's a northern front, could be the big one. He snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. We need to get home and batten down. This could get bad. They made it back to the ranch just as the first flakes started falling. By the time they'd unloaded the wagon and secured the animals, the snow was coming down in sheets, driven by wind that howled like something alive. Silas moved through the ranch with grim efficiency, checking every door and window, making sure the barn was secure, herding the chickens into their shelter. Get inside, he told Evelyn. Start heating water and cooking. We might be stuck for days. The storm hit in full that night, and it was unlike anything Evelyn had experienced. Wind hammered the cabin walls, finding gaps that shrieked with cold. Snow piled against the windows, blocking out the world. The temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of the walls, and even huddled by the fire, Evelyn could see her breath. Silas kept the fires burning, rationing wood carefully while still maintaining enough heat to keep them from freezing. They ate hot meals and stayed close to the hearth, sleeping in shifts so someone was always awake to tend the fire. Tommy was stranded in the barn with the animals, and Silas made dangerous trips through the whiteout every few hours to check on him and bring him food. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the world was buried under 3 feet of snow, with drifts twice that height against buildings and hillsides. The ranch was intact, but barely. One section of fence had collapsed under the weight, and several trees had come down, one narrowly missing the chicken coop. But that wasn't the worst of it. The morning after the storm cleared, a rider came up from the valley, barely visible against the white landscape. He was wrapped in so many layers that Evelyn couldn't identify him until he was practically at their door. When he pulled down his scarf, she recognized him as one of the ranchers from Wolf Creek, a quiet man named Peter Chen, who ran a small operation south of the settlement. Silas, his voice was hoarse, desperate. We need help. Storm-trapped families up in the North Valley, at least 6 homesteads, maybe more. We can't reach them. The pass is blocked with snow and fallen trees. How bad? Silas was already pulling on his warmest coat. Bad. They've been cut off for 4 days now. Some of those cabins aren't built for this kind of storm. We're talking women and children, Silas. They're probably out of firewood, maybe out of food. Peter's face was haggard. We tried to organize a rescue from the settlement, but half the men are too scared to go through Black Fang Pass in these conditions. The trail's a death trap right now. They're not wrong to be scared. Black Fangs killed people in good weather. And this... Silas trailed off, his expression grim. But we can't leave them up there to freeze. No one's asking you to go, Peter said, but his tone said he absolutely was asking. I just thought you should know. In case you felt like you could help. I'll go. Silas turned to Evelyn.
I need to pack supplies and get Tommy ready. This'll take days, maybe a week. You'll have to manage the ranch alone." "No." Evelyn said it before thinking. "I'm coming with you." Both men stared at her. Silas shook his head. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. You just said there are families trapped up there, women and children. They'll need someone who can help with more than just hauling supplies and clearing trails." Evelyn pulled on her own coat. "I can tend wounds, help with children, cook for people who are probably too exhausted and cold to take care of themselves. You need me. What I need is for you to be safe here. This is exactly the kind of thing I warned you about. And I told you I wasn't going to break." Evelyn's voice rose. "You don't get to marry me, train me to survive this place, and then leave me behind when things get hard. If you're going, I'm going. That's final." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but Peter interrupted. "She's right, Silas. We could use someone with those skills. Most of the men heading up are ranchers and miners. Nobody's got much experience with sick or injured people, especially kids." The internal war playing out on Silas's face was visible, concern for Evelyn fighting against the practical need for her help. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. "Fine. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. This isn't the ranch. One wrong move up there, and you're dead." "Understood." They spent the next hour organizing with brutal efficiency. Silas packed supplies onto 3 horses: food, blankets, medicine, tools for clearing trails. Tommy would come with them, along with Peter and 2 other men who'd agreed to attempt the rescue. It was a small group, but that was strategic. Too many people would slow them down, and speed might mean the difference between life and death for the families trapped in the North Valley. They left at dawn, riding into a landscape transformed by the storm. The world was white and silent, beautiful in a way that felt alien and hostile. The horses struggled through deep snow, each step requiring enormous effort. Within an hour, Evelyn was exhausted, her thighs burning from gripping the saddle, her face numb despite the scarf wrapped around it. Black Fang Pass was worse than she'd imagined. The trail, barely visible under the snow, climbed steeply between walls of rock, narrowing to a path that could only accommodate single-file travel. Fallen trees blocked the way in multiple places, requiring the men to dismount and clear debris with axes and saws. The work was backbreaking in the thin, cold air, and progress was agonizingly slow. They'd been climbing for 3 hours when the trail disappeared entirely, buried under an avalanche that had come down during the storm. The snow had piled so deep that there was no way through, just a wall of white blocking the pass. "We'll have to go around," Silas said, studying the terrain. "There's an old game trail that cuts through the ridge. It's steeper and more dangerous, but it's our only option." "How much longer?" one of the other men asked, a miner named Samuel who was already looking exhausted. 4 hours. Maybe 5 in these conditions. Silas glanced at the sky, where clouds were already starting to gather again. "And we need to be off the pass before dark, so we move fast." The game trail was terrifying. It clung to the side of the mountain like a scar, sometimes so narrow that the horses' hooves came within inches of the edge. Looking down made Evelyn's stomach lurch, just open air and a drop that would kill anything that fell. She kept her eyes forward, focused on Silas's back, trusting the horse to find its footing. They were halfway across when Tommy's horse stumbled. The animal caught itself, but the supplies it was carrying shifted, throwing off its balance. Tommy grabbed for the saddle, but his hands were too cold, his grip too weak. He started to slide sideways toward the edge, his face going white with terror. Silas moved faster than seemed possible, dismounting and lunging for Tommy, catching him just as he began to fall. He hauled the younger man back onto the trail with brute strength, then steadied the panicking horse before it could bolt and take them all down. "You all right?" Silas's voice was sharp. "I think so." Tommy was shaking, either from cold or shock. "Thanks, boss. Thank me when we're off this trail. Everyone check your loads. If anything's loose, secure it now." They continued on, even more careful now. The game trail eventually rejoined the main pass on the other side of the avalanche, and by the time they reached more level ground, the sun was starting to set. They'd made it through Black Fang Pass, but they were all exhausted. The horses were struggling, and they still had miles to go before reaching the first of the trapped homesteads. "We camp here," Silas decided, pointing to a sheltered spot under an overhang. "Get a fire going, tend the horses, eat something hot.
We'll need our strength for tomorrow. Setting up camp in the snow was another lesson in frontier survival. They had to dig down to bare ground for the fire, create a windbreak with branches and blankets, melt snow for water. Evelyn helped where she could, her movements clumsy with cold and fatigue. But eventually they had a fire going, horses picketed and fed, and hot stew passing between them. First homestead should be about 2 hours from here, Peter said, consulting a rough map. The Henderson place, family of 4, parents and 2 young girls. Cabin solid but small. They'll be hurting for firewood by now. We split up after Henderson, Silas said. Peter, you and Samuel take 2 horses and head east to the Miller and Chen homesteads. Tommy, Evelyn, and I will go north to the Patterson place and the widow's cabin beyond that. We meet back at the trail junction in 3 days. If someone doesn't show, we assume they're in trouble and go looking. It was a grim plan, but necessary. They couldn't afford to travel together when families were scattered across miles of frozen valley. Better to split up and cover more ground, even if it increased the risk. That night, sleeping huddled around the fire with the temperature dropping below anything Evelyn had experienced, she understood why Silas had tried to keep her from coming. This wasn't survival, it was endurance at the edge of what humans could withstand. Her feet were numb despite 2 pairs of socks in her boots. Her fingers ached even inside gloves. Every breath burned her lungs with cold that felt sharp enough to cut. But she also understood that the families trapped in these mountains needed help. And if she'd stayed behind at the ranch while Silas risked his life to save them, she would never have forgiven herself. They reached the Henderson homestead at mid-morning. The cabin was intact but dark, no smoke rising from the chimney. Silas dismounted and approached cautiously, calling out before he opened the door. Inside was a scene of quiet desperation. The Henderson family huddled together under every blanket they owned, the father trying to keep his daughters warm while his wife fed the last of their wood to a fire that was barely more than embers. Silas Boone, the father, James Henderson said, his voice weak with relief and exhaustion. Thank Christ you came. We've been out of firewood for 2 days. I tried to go out and gather more, but the snow's too deep. I couldn't get more than 50 feet from the cabin before I had to turn back. We've got supplies. Silas was already unloading blankets and food. Evelyn, check them for frostbite. Tommy, help me get their fire going again. Evelyn moved to the family, her training kicking in. The mother had frostbite on 3 fingers, painful but not severe enough to require amputation. One of the daughters was feverish, probably from exposure. The other daughter and the father were in better shape, but all of them were dangerously cold and undernourished. She worked quickly, wrapping the mother's fingers properly, dosing the sick daughter with medicine from their supplies, getting hot broth into all of them. Silas and Tommy got a proper fire roaring and stacked firewood in the cabin, enough to last until the family could get out and gather more themselves. Storm's supposed to clear in a few days, Silas told James. Once it does, get down to the settlement if you can. If you can't, stay put and keep the fire going. We'll check on you on our way back through. They stayed only long enough to make sure the family was stable, then pushed on. There were more people who needed help, and they were racing against another storm that Silas said was building in the north. The Patterson homestead was worse. They found the father dead in the snow outside the cabin, frozen while trying to reach the barn to save his livestock. Inside, his wife and 3 sons were barely alive, huddled in one room that still had some warmth. The youngest boy, maybe 5 years old, wasn't moving. Evelyn went to work immediately while Silas and Tommy dealt with the body outside. The mother was incoherent with grief and cold. The 2 older boys were in shock but responsive. The youngest, she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint and slow, but present. His skin was cold as ice, his breathing so shallow she could barely detect it. He's hypothermic, she told Silas when he came back inside. Severe. I need to warm him slowly or his heart could stop. What do you need? Hot water, blankets, and someone to hold him. Body heat's the best way to warm someone this cold. Silas got the fire blazing while Evelyn stripped the boy's frozen clothes and wrapped him in blankets. Then she held him against her chest, sharing her body heat, warming his hands and feet with careful attention. Tommy brought hot water and she used it to make compresses, placing them strategically to warm the boy's core without shocking his system. It took hours of holding this child who wasn't hers, willing him to live, while Silas tended to the rest of the family and dealt with the harsh reality of burying a man in frozen ground. The storm Silas had warned about rolled in while they worked, trapping them at the Patterson homestead for the night. Around midnight, the boy opened his eyes. His first word was Papa, and Evelyn had to tell him, as gently as she could, that his father wasn't coming back. The grief in his small face nearly broke her, but she held him while he cried. And gradually he fell asleep again, this time with normal breathing and color returning to his cheeks. "You saved him," Silas said quietly, settling beside her near the fire. "Another hour, and he would have been gone." "Maybe." Evelyn was too tired to feel triumphant. "But his father's still dead. These boys are going to grow up without him." "Yeah, but they're going to grow up. That's because of you." He reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "I was wrong to try to keep you from coming. You were right. We needed you here." The admission cost him something, and Evelyn understood that. Silas wasn't a man who admitted mistakes easily. She leaned against him, too exhausted for words, and they sat together while the storm raged outside and the Patterson family slept fitfully around them. The next morning, they left the widow Patterson with supplies and instructions. Tommy would return for them once the pass was clear, bringing a wagon to help transport them to the settlement where they'd have family to stay with. But for now, they were stable and safe, and that was all Silas and Evelyn could do. The widow's cabin, their last stop before meeting back up with Peter and Samuel, was the most remote, another 3 hours of riding through fresh snow. When they finally reached it, Evelyn was beyond exhausted, running on will alone. The cabin was dark. No smoke, no movement. Silas's face went grim. "Stay here," he told her, dismounting. "If this is what I think it is, you don't need to see it." But Evelyn followed him anyway, and when Silas opened the door, they found the widow, Mary Chen, Peter's aunt, dead in her bed. She looked peaceful, like she'd simply fallen asleep and not woken up. The cold had taken her quietly, and from the looks of it, she'd been gone for at least 2 days. Silas stood in the doorway for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. Then he said, "I'll prepare the body. Check for anything of value, letters, keepsakes, things her family might want." They worked in heavy silence, treating the dead woman with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed. Evelyn found letters tied with ribbon, a locket with pictures of children, a Bible worn soft with use. She packaged them carefully while Silas wrapped the body in blankets. They'd have to come back with a wagon to retrieve her for proper burial, but for now, they did what they could. Outside, the world was white and still. 3 days of brutal travel, 2 families saved, 1 man dead, 1 woman dead, and 1 boy who'd nearly joined them. Evelyn felt the weight of it settling into her bones, the cost of survival in this place, the thin line between life and death, the knowledge that winter had only just begun. "We should head to the meeting point," Silas said. "Peter and Samuel will be waiting." They rode in silence through the white landscape, and when they finally reached the trail junction, they found Peter and Samuel already there, looking as haggard as Evelyn felt. The 4 of them shared brief updates. Peter's group had found 3 families, all alive but struggling. They'd distributed supplies and would check on them again in a few days. "Your aunt didn't make it," Silas told Peter quietly. "I'm sorry." "We found her in her cabin. Looked peaceful." Peter's face crumpled, but he nodded. "She was old, stubborn about staying up there alone. I tried to get her to move to the settlement last fall, but she refused." He took a shaky breath. "Thank you for looking after her." They made the journey back through Black Fang Pass in one long, punishing push, arriving at the ranch after dark. Tommy immediately disappeared to the barn, while Evelyn and Silas stumbled into the cabin, too tired to do more than bank the fire and collapse into bed fully clothed. Evelyn fell asleep immediately, her body finally giving in to exhaustion, but her dreams were haunted by frozen faces. The Patterson boys' pale skin, James Henderson's body in the snow, Mary Chen sleeping her final sleep. She woke several times in the night, disoriented and cold despite Silas's warmth beside her. The next morning, word of their rescue spread through Wolf Creek. People who'd been too afraid to attempt the pass themselves suddenly had opinions about how it should have been done. Martha Harrison made sure everyone heard her version, that it was reckless, that Silas had risked his new bride unnecessarily, that people who couldn't survive the frontier without rescue didn't belong in the mountains. But others saw it differently. Margaret hugged Evelyn fiercely when they came in for supplies the following week. "You saved those families. Don't let anyone tell you different." Even some of the ranchers who'd been skeptical of the mail-order bride from Boston offered respectful nods. She'd proven something by going up there, by nearly dying to help people she barely knew. She wasn't just Silas's wife anymore. She was someone who'd earned her place in Wolf Creek Valley. But the cost of that acceptance sat heavy in Evelyn's chest. She kept seeing the Patterson boy's face, kept wondering if she'd done enough, fast enough, kept thinking about all the ways the rescue could have gone wrong. Tommy falling from that trail, the widow already dead when they arrived, the storm trapping them all in the mountains.
"You did good up there," Silas said one night, weeks later, when the nightmares had her awake again. "Better than good. You were brave and competent, and you saved that boy's life. Don't let the what-ifs eat at you." "How do you do it?" Evelyn asked. "Live with all the death, all the close calls and terrible possibilities?" "I don't know if you ever get used to it," Silas admitted. "You just learn to carry it, to remember that for every person who doesn't make it, there's someone who does because you tried." He pulled her closer. "That boy's going to grow up because of you. Henderson's daughters are going to have their father because we got there in time. That has to be enough." "What if it's not?" "Then you're human, and you keep trying anyway." Evelyn turned to face him in the darkness. This hard man who'd pulled her from a flood and taught her to survive and taken her into the mountains to save people he barely knew. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me come, for trusting me. Thank you for being stubborn enough to insist." Silas kissed her forehead. "We're partners now. That means we face the hard things together, even when I'm scared of losing you to them." They fell asleep tangled together, and this time Evelyn's dreams were quieter, still haunted, but bearable. Winter would throw more at them before it was done. There would be more storms, more danger, more moments where survival balanced on a knife's edge. But they'd face it together, and that would have to be enough. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like spring after a brutal winter, in small gestures and quiet shifts that most people didn't notice until the pattern was already established. It started with Sarah Henderson, James's wife, showing up at the ranch 2 weeks after the rescue with a basket of bread and preserves. "I know it's not much," she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway with her 2 daughters hiding behind her skirts. "But I wanted to thank you proper for what you did up there, for saving us." Evelyn took the basket, surprised by the weight of it. "You didn't need to do this." "Yes, I did." Sarah's voice was firm. "You risked your life for strangers. That deserves more than words." She hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, help with preserving, sewing, whatever, you send for me. I mean that." After Sarah left, Evelyn stood in the cabin looking at the basket, feeling something shift in her chest. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was recognition. She'd been accepted, not as Silas's mail-order bride or the outsider from Boston, but as someone who belonged. 2 days later, Mary Patterson arrived with her 3 sons. The youngest, the boy Evelyn had saved, ran straight to her and wrapped his arms around her waist without a word. His mother's eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "We're moving to the settlement," Mary said. "Can't stay in that cabin anymore, too many memories. But I wanted to bring you this first." She held out a quilt, beautifully made, the stitching precise and careful. "It was my grandmother's. She brought it west 40 years ago, and it's been in my family ever since. I want you to have it." "Mary, I can't." "You can, and you will." Mary's voice cracked slightly. "You held my boy when he was dying. You brought him back to me. A quilt's nothing compared to that." Evelyn took it, the weight of the gift settling over her like a promise. When the Patterson family left, the youngest boy looked back and waved, and Evelyn waved back, her throat tight. "People are starting to see you different," Silas observed that evening, running his hand over the quilt where it lay draped across their bed. "Not as the outsider anymore. As one of them." "Is that good or bad?" "Depends. Means they'll come to you when they need help. Means they'll expect you to be part of this community, for better or worse." He looked at her seriously. "And it means Martha Harrison's going to hate you even more, because you're getting the respect she thinks she deserves." Silas was right. Within a month, Evelyn had become someone people turned to, not for ranching advice or frontier skills, where Silas remained the expert, but for everything else. Women started showing up at the ranch with questions about sick children, recipe problems, disputes with neighbors. Men who would never have asked Silas for help with domestic matters found themselves standing awkwardly in the yard, asking if Mrs. Boone could help with a daughter's fever or a wife's difficult pregnancy. Evelyn didn't plan for any of it. She just helped when asked, drawing on her teaching experience and her instinct for reading people. She taught Sarah Henderson's daughters to read during the long winter afternoons when the family stayed with them for a week while their cabin chimney was being repaired. She helped Margaret reorganize the store's inventory system, making it easier to track supplies and prevent shortages. She even mediated a bitter dispute between two mining families over a claim boundary, finding a compromise that satisfied no one completely but prevented violence. "You're building something," Silas said one night, watching her write a letter for a rancher who couldn't read or write but needed to contact family back east. "A network, people helping people. It's not just charity. You're creating obligations and relationships that hold this valley together." "I'm just doing what needs doing. That's how every important thing starts." He was quiet for a moment. Sarah tried to do something similar, but she was too soft, too gentle. People took advantage of her kindness. "You're different. You help, but you don't let anyone walk over you." It was true. When Jack Crawford's companion showed up drunk one afternoon demanding Evelyn help with a wound he'd gotten in a bar fight, she'd refused. "Come back sober and I'll consider it," she'd told him, standing in the doorway with Silas's rifle visible behind her. "But I don't help people too stupid to take care of themselves." Word of that got around too, earning her grudging respect from men who might have otherwise seen her help as weakness. She was competent and willing, but she had limits. That made her useful rather than exploitable. Winter deepened, bringing more storms and more challenges. The rescue had depleted their supplies faster than expected, and by late January, they were rationing carefully. Other families in the valley were worse off. Some had lost livestock to the cold, others had cabins damaged by heavy snow, and everyone was running low on essentials that wouldn't be available until spring. Evelyn started organizing. She'd noticed during her visits around the valley that different families had different surpluses. One might have extra flour but need lamp oil, another had preserved meat but desperately needed medicine. She began keeping track, creating an informal trading network that helped distribute resources more efficiently. "The Chens have extra bacon they're willing to trade," she told Silas one evening, consulting the notes she'd been keeping. "The Millers need bacon but have surplus wheat, and the Harrisons have wheat but need—" "The Harrisons have everything," Silas interrupted. "They're the richest family in the valley. They don't need to trade." "Everyone needs something, even Martha." Evelyn tapped her notes. "I'm going to talk to her tomorrow, see if she'll participate." "That's a terrible idea." "Probably. But if the richest family in the valley is hoarding resources while their neighbors starve, someone needs to say something. And that someone has to be you?" "Would you rather it be you?" Evelyn challenged. "You'd probably end up shooting someone." "Fair point," Silas sighed. "Fine, but I'm coming with you. If Martha tries anything, I want to be there." The Harrison Ranch was impressive by frontier standards. A large main house, multiple outbuildings, fenced pastures that stretched for miles. They'd clearly spent money importing lumber and supplies that most families could never afford. It was a statement of wealth and power, and Martha had built her identity around it. She received them in her parlor, a room that looked absurdly out of place on the frontier, velvet curtains, imported furniture, a piano that must have cost a fortune to transport. Martha herself was dressed like she was receiving guests in Boston, not entertaining neighbors in the Wyoming wilderness. "Mrs. Boone, Silas, how unexpected." Her smile was all ice. "To what do I owe this visit?" "I'm organizing a resource exchange," Evelyn said, refusing to be intimidated by the surroundings. "Helping families trade what they have for what they need. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to participate." "Why would I need to trade?" Martha's tone made it clear she found the suggestion offensive. "We have everything we require." "I'm sure you do, but other families don't, and winter isn't over yet. If we work together, we can make sure everyone survives until spring." Evelyn kept her voice level. "I thought someone in your position might want to help lead that effort." It was a calculated appeal to Martha's ego, the suggestion that participating would be a leadership position rather than charity. For a moment, Martha's expression flickered with interest. Then she seemed to remember who she was talking to, and the ice returned. "I don't see why my family's resources should be distributed to people too incompetent to plan properly. If they're struggling, perhaps they shouldn't be out here in the first place." "Like me?" Evelyn asked. "I was incompetent when I arrived, but people helped me anyway. Sarah Henderson gave me bread. Mary Patterson gave me a quilt. Even you offered guidance, remember? About frontier society and proper standards? Martha's jaw tightened. That was different. Was it? Or are you just unwilling to help now that I've proven I belong here as much as you do? Evelyn stood, signaling the conversation was over. I thought you might want to be part of something good, something that brings this valley together. But I was wrong. We'll manage without you. She walked out before Martha could respond, Silas following with what might have been an amused expression. They were halfway to their horses when Martha's voice called out, "Wait!"
They turned. Martha stood on her porch, her perfect composure cracked slightly. What exactly would participation entail? Over the next hour, sitting at Martha's expensive dining table, Evelyn laid out her plan. Each family would contribute what they could spare, food, supplies, labor, skills, to a common pool. In return, they could draw what they needed, with the understanding that they'd repay when able. It wasn't charity, it was mutual survival. And Martha, with her resources and social position, could help coordinate and legitimize the effort. People respect your opinion, Evelyn said, which was partly true and partly flattery. If you support this, others will follow. And when spring comes and this valley has survived because we worked together, you'll be remembered as someone who made that possible. Martha agreed, though Evelyn suspected it was more about maintaining her position than genuine charity. But the motivation didn't matter. What mattered was that the richest family in Wolf Creek was now part of the network, which meant no one could claim it was just for the desperate and struggling. The resource exchange transformed the valley's winter survival. Families who'd been isolating in their struggle suddenly had support systems. A homesteader with carpentry skills helped repair storm-damaged cabins in exchange for food. A woman with midwifery experience traveled between ranches, helping with difficult births and women's health issues in exchange for whatever families could offer. The mining families, who had cash but limited resources, bought supplies in bulk and distributed them through the network at cost. Evelyn managed it all from the ranch, keeping meticulous records, facilitating trades, resolving disputes. It was exhausting work on top of running the ranch with Silas, but it gave her purpose beyond mere survival. You're building a community, Margaret said one afternoon, helping Evelyn sort through requests and available resources. A real one, not just people living near each other, but actual connections and obligations. This valley's never had that before. It's just practical. Everyone benefits when we help each other. It's more than practical, and you know it. Margaret looked at her seriously. You're changing how people think about the frontier, making them see that surviving alone isn't the same as thriving together. That's rare out here. Most people are too independent or too suspicious to trust their neighbors. But the network wasn't universally popular. Jack Crawford made his opinion known one day when Evelyn was in the settlement picking up supplies. He cornered her outside the store, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. Heard you're running some kind of charity operation, redistributing resources like you're the queen of the valley. I'm helping people trade fairly. If you have something to contribute, you're welcome to participate. I don't need help from some Boston woman playing frontier saint. He stepped closer, deliberately invading her space. You think you're better than everyone because you went up that mountain once? Because you saved some crying brat? That doesn't make you special. I never said it did. Evelyn held her ground, refusing to show fear. But it does make me someone who helps instead of tearing others down. You should try it sometime. Jack's hand shot out, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. You got a mouth on you. Someone should teach you. Let her go. Silas's voice came from behind Jack, cold and deadly. Now. Jack released Evelyn and turned, his companions materializing from the saloon like jackals sensing conflict. The street had gone silent, people stopping to watch. This was the confrontation everyone had known was coming since the day Evelyn first stood up to Jack. Problem, Boone? Yeah. You putting your hands on my wife, that's a problem. Silas moved to stand beside Evelyn, his body coiled with violence barely restrained. You got an issue with what she's doing. You bring it to me. You touch her again, I'll break every bone in your hand. Big talk from a man who couldn't even keep his first family alive through winter. The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn felt Silas flinch beside her, saw his hand drift toward his knife. The moment stretched out, dangerous and electric. One wrong move and someone would die in the street. My first family, Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm.
died because I was too far away to help them. I live with that every day. But you're standing right here, Jack, which means if you keep running your mouth, I won't be too far away to do something about it." Jack's companions were already backing away, recognizing the edge in Silas's tone. They'd seen him kill before, that rustler in the canyon, and they knew he meant every word. Jack himself hesitated, his bravado crumbling in the face of real violence. "This ain't over," he muttered, but he was already retreating toward the saloon. "Yeah, it is," Silas said, "because if I see you near my wife again, you won't walk away." The crowd dispersed slowly, disappointed there hadn't been blood. Evelyn's arm throbbed where Jack had grabbed her, but she refused to acknowledge the pain until they were safely back on their horses and heading home. "You didn't have to threaten him," she said finally. "Yes, I did. Men like Jack only understand violence. You can't reason with them, can't appeal to their better nature because they don't have one." Silas's jaw was tight. "He put his hands on you. That requires a response or he'll do it again, and next time I might not be there. I can handle Jack Crawford. I know you can, but you shouldn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. "What he said about Sarah and Michael was cruel and untrue. You weren't responsible for that storm or that winter. You did everything you could." "Wasn't enough, though, was it?" The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. "And now I'm watching you put yourself at risk every day with this network you've built, this community you're trying to help. Every time you ride out to check on a family, every time you mediate a dispute or help someone I don't trust, I'm terrified I'm going to lose you the same way." Evelyn pulled her horse closer to his, close enough to reach out and touch his arm. "You're not going to lose me. I'm not Sarah. I'm not gentle. I'm not helpless. And I don't break easily. You taught me that, remember? You made me strong enough to survive here. Doesn't mean I can't worry. Worry all you want. Just don't try to stop me. This work matters, Silas. It's keeping people alive." He nodded, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. And Evelyn understood. He'd already buried one wife. The thought of burying another was probably what kept him awake at night, the nightmare underlying every risk she took. February brought another storm, this one worse than the first. It trapped them at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks, the snow piling so high they had to dig tunnels just to reach the barn. They rationed food carefully, killed 2 chickens they couldn't afford to lose, and burned furniture when the firewood ran low. Tommy moved into the cabin because the barn was too cold, and the 3 of them lived in the main room, keeping the fire going in shifts, sleeping in their clothes, doing everything they could to survive. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find the valley transformed again. Several cabins had collapsed under snow weight, livestock had died throughout the region, and worst of all, the trail to the settlement was completely impassable, blocked by multiple avalanches that would take weeks to clear. "We're cut off," Silas said, surveying the damage from their ridge. "No way to get supplies, no way to reach town, no way to help anyone who needs it." "Then people will have to come here," Evelyn said. "The ranch is defensible. We have some supplies left, and we're centrally located. We can make this a shelter point until the trail's clear. We don't have enough for everyone. We have enough to keep people from freezing or starving. That'll have to do." Silas looked at her like she was crazy, but he didn't argue. And when word spread that the Boone Ranch was offering shelter, families started arriving, some on foot through chest-deep snow, others on horses or in sledges. They came desperate and exhausted, and Evelyn took them all in. Within 3 days, the ranch was overflowing. People slept in the barn, in the cabin loft, around the main room fire. They hung blankets to create privacy, shared meals from a common pot, took turns keeping watch and maintaining fires. It was chaotic and uncomfortable and nothing like Evelyn had imagined when she first came west. But it worked. She organized it with the same ruthless efficiency she'd applied to the resource network. Everyone had tasks: gathering wood, melting snow, cooking, caring for children, tending animals. No one got to just sit idle consuming resources. Even the children had jobs, and they rose to the challenge with surprising maturity. Sarah Henderson taught reading lessons in the afternoon, turning the crisis into an educational opportunity. Mary Patterson led sewing circles where women repaired clothes and made new ones from scraps. The men took turns digging out paths and checking on neighboring homesteads that hadn't been able to reach the ranch. Tommy, freed from his usual shyness by the constant activity, became the go-to person for managing supplies and distributing rations. And Evelyn kept everything running, settling disputes, making hard decisions about rationing,
caring for the sick and injured. She hardly slept, barely ate, pushed herself until exhaustion became her permanent state. But the community held together. Silas worked just as hard handling the physical labor and security concerns. He posted watches at night, organized patrols to check for threats, made sure no one froze in the barn. Together, they kept 37 people alive through the worst part of winter. Not just alive, but functioning, maintaining hope and dignity despite the brutal conditions. Martha Harrison showed up in the second week with a sledge full of supplies, food, blankets, medicine. Her arrival stunned everyone, including Evelyn. Martha had always been the first to judge, the last to help, but she dismounted and started distributing goods without preamble. "I'm not staying," she told Evelyn quietly. "My ranch is secure and I'm needed there, but I couldn't sit comfortable knowing people were suffering when I could help." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and meant it. "This means more than you know." "You were right," Martha admitted, her voice low enough that others couldn't hear. "About community, about working together. I thought being superior meant being separate, but watching what you've built here," she trailed off. "I was wrong, and I'm trying to do better." It wasn't friendship, Martha was too proud for that, but it was respect, and it was more than Evelyn had expected from a woman who'd seen her as competition and threat. The trails finally cleared in early March. Families returned to their homesteads to assess damage and begin repairs. The ranch emptied gradually, people leaving with thanks and promises to repay the shelter they'd received. Within a week, it was back to just Evelyn, Silas, and Tommy, and the sudden quiet felt strange after weeks of constant noise and activity. "We made it," Evelyn said, standing in the yard looking at the valley. Snow was already melting in the sun, revealing brown grass and mud. Spring was coming. Barely. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Lost weight you couldn't afford to lose, worked yourself half to death, turned our ranch into a refugee camp. Worth it, though. Everyone survived." Yeah, they did." He turned her to face him, and she saw something new in his expression, not just love or respect, but awe. "You did that. You kept them all alive." "We did that. You and me and Tommy and everyone else who helped. It wasn't just me. But you organized it. You made people work together instead of tearing each other apart. That's not something anyone could do. That's special." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. Exhaustion and relief and the overwhelming emotion of having survived something that had nearly broken them. "I just wanted everyone to make it through winter." And they did. Because you're the most stubborn, capable, infuriating woman I've ever met. Silas kissed her forehead. "I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I ever doubted you could handle the frontier. You don't just handle it, you're changing it." The wedding had been planned before winter, but circumstances had forced delays. Now, with spring emerging and the crisis past, people remembered there was celebration to be had. Someone suggested a proper party at the ranch, a thank you gathering for Silas and Evelyn's hospitality during the storms. "We don't need a party," Evelyn protested to Margaret, who'd shown up with Peter Chen to start planning. "We were just doing what needed to be done. And that's exactly why we need to celebrate it," Margaret said firmly. "This valley almost tore itself apart this winter. You two held it together. That deserves recognition." The party happened on the first truly warm day of spring, when the snow had finally melted enough to reveal green grass and early wildflowers. People came from across the valley, families who'd sheltered at the ranch, others who'd been helped by the resource network, even Martha Harrison with her husband and servants. They brought food, music, stories. Someone had made a banner that read "Black Ridge Ranch, Heart of Wolf Creek Valley," and hung it across the barn entrance. The Henderson girls performed a reading they'd learned during those long afternoons of lessons. Mary Patterson's boys sang a song their mother had taught them. Even Jack Crawford's former companions showed up, having quietly distanced themselves from their old leader after his confrontation with Silas. "To Silas and Evelyn Boone," Peter Chen said, raising a glass of whiskey as the sun set over the valley. "For showing us that frontier living doesn't mean living alone, for building something worth fighting for making Wolf Creek feel like home." The toast was met with cheers and applause. Evelyn felt Silas's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining. She looked around at the faces gathered in their yard, people who'd been strangers months ago, who'd become neighbors and allies and something approaching friends.
This was what she'd been missing in Boston, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant. Evelyn shook her head, but Silas nudged her forward. She stood awkwardly, unused to being the center of attention, and the crowd quieted. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I came here thinking I was escaping something. Loneliness, purposelessness, a life that felt too small. And I found all of that here. The frontier is lonely and hard and demands everything you have. But I also found something I didn't expect. I found people who help each other not because it's easy, but because it's necessary, who share what they have even when they have almost nothing, who open their homes to neighbors and strangers alike because that's what survival requires." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "This winter almost killed us, but it didn't because we refused to let it. We fought together, shared together, survived together, and that's what I want to remember. Not how hard it was, but how strong we were when it mattered most." The applause this time was quieter, but more genuine. As people dispersed to eat and talk and celebrate, Evelyn found herself surrounded by women wanting to thank her personally, to share their own stories of the winter, to promise their support for whatever came next. Sarah Henderson squeezed her hand. "You gave my daughters hope this winter, showed them that women can be strong and capable. That's a gift worth more than food or shelter." Mary Patterson hugged her fiercely. "You saved my boy twice. Once from freezing, once from despair. I'll never forget that." Even Martha approached, her usual superiority muted. "I misjudged you. I thought you were weak, that you'd run at the first real test. I was wrong, and I'm woman enough to admit it." As the party continued into the night, Evelyn slipped away to the ridge where Silas had taken her months ago, the place that overlooked the entire valley. He found her there, as she'd known he would, and they stood together watching the lights from the party below. "Thinking about Boston?" he asked. "Thinking about how far away it feels? Like another lifetime. Any regrets?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. She thought about the flood that had nearly killed her, the brutal training, Jack Crawford's cruelty, Martha Harrison's judgment, the terror of the rescue mission, the exhaustion of sheltering families through winter. She thought about bleeding hands and frozen feet and the constant grinding work of survival. "No," she said finally. "No regrets. This is where I belong. Even though it's hard, because it's hard. Because it matters. Because I matter here in a way I never did in the city." She leaned into him. "And because I love you. That wasn't part of the plan, but it happened anyway." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I love you too. Didn't think I could again after Sarah. Didn't think I deserved to. But you showed up half-drowned and stubborn as hell, and somehow you made me believe in second chances." They kissed on that ridge while below their friends and neighbors celebrated, and Evelyn thought about the future. Spring was here, which meant planting and building and preparing for the next winter. There would be more challenges, more storms, more moments when survival balanced on a knife's edge. But they'd face it together, not just her and Silas, but the entire community they'd built from desperation and need. The woman who'd stepped off that stage in Cheyenne 6 months ago wouldn't have believed any of this was possible. She'd been small and scared and running from loneliness. The woman standing on this ridge was different, scarred by experience, hardened by survival, but also stronger and more certain than she'd ever been. She'd come to Wyoming to marry a stranger and escape her old life. Instead, she'd found herself. And in the process, she'd helped build something rare on the frontier, a community that actually functioned, that supported its members, that understood survival was a collective effort rather than an individual struggle. "Come on," Silas said, pulling her back toward the party. "People will wonder where we went." "Let them wonder. They'll probably make up stories more interesting than the truth anyway. That we're up here being sentimental? That we're up here being human, taking a moment to appreciate what we've built before the next disaster hits. Always expecting disaster. You're learning." "I've had a good teacher," Evelyn smiled. "Come on, let's go celebrate with people who think we're heroes, even though we were just trying to survive." They walked back down to the ranch together, hand in hand, and rejoined the party that was really a celebration of something larger than any individual, the frontier spirit at its best, when isolation gave way to community and survival became something worth celebrating rather than just enduring. The night stretched on, full of music and laughter,
and the kind of joy that only comes after surviving something terrible together. And when it finally ended and the last guest departed, when the ranch was quiet again except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, Evelyn and Silas sat together in the darkness and simply breathed. They'd made it through winter. They'd kept their community alive. They'd built something lasting from the raw materials of need and determination. And tomorrow, they'd wake up and start preparing for whatever came next. Because that's what frontier living demanded: constant vigilance, endless work, unwavering stubbornness in the face of a landscape that didn't care whether you survived or not. But tonight, they could rest. Tonight, they could be proud of what they'd accomplished. Tonight, they were home. Spring turned into summer, and with it came the hard work of building rather than merely surviving. The valley was scarred from winter: collapsed structures, lost livestock, families who'd barely held on, but it was also alive with possibility. Evelyn stood on the porch one morning in late May, watching Silas and Tommy repair fence line, and realized something had fundamentally changed in how she saw this place. It wasn't the enemy anymore. It was home, with all the complicated love that word implied. "You're staring," Silas called out, catching her watching. "Either come help or stop distracting me." "I'm supervising. It's an important job." "It's lazy, is what it is." But he was smiling, and that smile had become more common over the past months. The hard edges hadn't disappeared, probably never would, but they'd softened enough that Evelyn could see the man he might have been before grief carved away his gentleness. She walked out to join them anyway, grabbing tools and falling into the rhythm they'd developed over months of working side by side. The fence line stretched for miles, and every section needed attention after the brutal winter. It was tedious, backbreaking work, but there was satisfaction in it, in making something functional, in preparing for the future rather than just scrambling to survive the present. "Got a letter from Margaret," Evelyn said during a water break. "She's proposing we build a proper school in Wolf Creek. Says there are enough children now to justify it, and after what I did teaching during the winter, people trust me to run it." Silas wiped sweat from his forehead. "That's a big commitment. Teaching means regular trips to the settlement, time away from the ranch. You sure you want that?" "I don't know. Part of me does. I miss teaching, miss feeling like I'm helping kids learn and grow, but another part of me knows how much work the ranch needs, and I don't want to leave you handling it all." "We'd manage. Tommy's getting better at the work, and I can hire another hand if needed." He paused, studying her. "Question is what you want, not what's practical or what helps the most people, but what makes you happy." It was a question Evelyn had been avoiding because the answer was complicated. She wanted everything: to run the ranch, to teach, to continue building the community network, to have time for herself and Silas. But wanting everything meant getting nothing done well, and she'd learned that frontier life demanded focus. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Margaret's not expecting an answer until fall anyway." But the conversation stayed with her over the following weeks as summer deepened and the ranch work intensified. They were expanding, buying more cattle with money saved from the resource network's success, clearing additional pasture land, building a second barn. Silas had plans for making Black Ridge the largest operation in the valley, and Evelyn could see the vision taking shape. Yet she also saw the gaps. Families were still struggling despite the mutual aid network. Children were growing up without education beyond what their parents could provide. The settlement had no real infrastructure, no school, no doctor, no organized governance beyond informal agreements and the threat of violence. Wolf Creek was functioning, but it wasn't thriving. "We need more than survival," she told Silas one evening, both of them exhausted from a day of cattle branding. "The valley's stable now, but stable isn't enough. We should be building things that last: institutions, systems, real community." "You sound like you're planning to run for mayor." "Wolf Creek doesn't have a mayor." "My point exactly." Silas stretched, his back cracking. "You want to change that? Start organizing something more formal?" "Maybe. I don't know. Feels presumptuous. I've only been here a year. And in that year, you've done more to hold this valley together than people who've been here a decade. If anyone's earned the right to push for changes, it's you." He looked at her seriously. "But fair warning, the moment you start trying to organize real governance, you're going to make enemies. People out here moved west to escape rules and structure. They're not going to embrace it just because you ask nicely. He was right, and Evelyn knew it. But she also knew that without some form of organization, Wolf Creek would always be vulnerable to strong personalities like Jack Crawford, to resource disputes, to the chaos that erupted when everyone operated on individual whims rather than collective agreements. The decision came to a head in July when a dispute over water rights nearly ended in bloodshed. Two ranching families, the Chens and the Harrisons' neighbors, the Reeves, both claimed access to a creek that ran between their properties. With summer drought reducing water flow, both families needed every drop for their cattle. Peter Chen showed up at Black Ridge Ranch one afternoon with a black eye and a request for mediation. Marcus Reeves says his claim was there first, that my family's been stealing water for years. I say the creek's on the boundary line and we both have rights to it. But Marcus is talking about damming it upstream, cutting off my access entirely. Peter's frustration was palpable. If he does that, my herd dies. And if my herd dies, my family starves. Evelyn looked at Silas, who was already shaking his head. This is exactly the kind of dispute that needs formal resolution, not me riding over there with a gun to enforce whatever decision we make. So what do you suggest? Peter asked. Because Marcus isn't going to listen to reason, and I'm not letting him kill my livelihood. We call a valley meeting, Evelyn said, the idea forming as she spoke. Every family with a stake in water access, plus neutral parties who can help make fair decisions. We establish rules about shared resources, not just this creek, but all of them. And we create a process for resolving disputes without violence. You think people will agree to that? Some will, others won't. But if enough people see the value, the holdouts will have to participate or risk being shut out of community support. She turned to Silas. We host it here. Neutral ground, and people already associate the ranch with community gatherings. If we frame it as solving this specific problem, but also preventing future ones, we might get buy-in. Silas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but if this goes sideways and we end up with a range war, I'm blaming you. Fair enough. Organizing the meeting was harder than Evelyn expected. Some families agreed immediately, seeing the value in structured dispute resolution. Others were suspicious, viewing it as an attempt to control them or impose unwanted authority. Marcus Reeves refused to attend at all, sending word that he'd handle his water rights however he saw fit, and anyone who disagreed could deal with his rifle. This is going to be a disaster, Silas predicted the morning of the meeting. Half the valley won't show, and the half that does will just argue. Probably, Evelyn agreed. But we have to try. Otherwise, we're just waiting for violence to solve problems, and that only works until someone dies. 23 families showed up, more than Evelyn had hoped for, though notably missing Marcus Reeves and, surprisingly, Jack Crawford. They gathered in the yard, some sitting on benches Tommy had built, others standing in clusters. The atmosphere was tense, everyone aware they were attempting something unprecedented. Evelyn stood on the porch, Silas beside her, and felt the weight of their attention. This was her idea, her push for change. If it failed, she'd be responsible. Thank you for coming, she began. I know some of you are skeptical about this meeting, about the idea of formal rules and dispute resolution. The Frontier's always operated on individual initiative and informal agreements, but we've all seen what happens when those agreements break down. We've seen violence over stolen cattle, claim disputes, resource access. We've lost people to conflicts that could have been prevented with clear rules and fair processes. What makes you think rules will stop men like Marcus Reeves? Someone called out. He's going to do what he wants regardless. You're right. Rules only work if enough people agree to follow them and enforce consequences for those who don't. But if most of the valley commits to a system, if we agree that water rights are shared based on property boundaries, that disputes go to mediation before violence, that we support each other in upholding those agreements, then holdouts like Marcus become the outliers rather than the norm. Margaret stood up from where she'd been sitting. I'm with Evelyn. We need structure. Need to know that when I extend credit at the store, there's a process for collecting debts. Need to know that if someone steals from me, there's recourse beyond shooting them or just accepting the loss. The current system doesn't work. It just rewards whoever's most willing to use violence. And who decides these rules? Martha Harrison's voice cut across the crowd. Who gets to sit in judgment of their neighbors? We all do, Evelyn said. I'm proposing we elect a council, 5 people who represent different interests in the valley.
ranchers, miners, merchants, homesteaders. They'd handle mediation, establish guidelines, coordinate community resources, and they'd be accountable to everyone here. If they abuse the position, we remove them and elect replacements.
Sounds like government, someone muttered. Thought we came west to escape that. No, Silas spoke up, his voice carrying authority. You came west to escape corrupt government run by people who didn't care about you. What Evelyn's proposing is different, local control by people who have to live with the consequences of their decisions. That's not tyranny, that's community taking responsibility for itself. The debate continued for hours, passionate and sometimes heated, but gradually a consensus emerged. Not everyone agreed, but enough people saw the value that they could move forward. By late afternoon, they'd outlined a basic framework: a 5-member council elected annually, a water rights system based on property boundaries and proportional usage, a mediation process for disputes, and community consequences for those who violated agreements. The elections happened immediately, with Evelyn deliberately not running despite Margaret's urging. She'd pushed for the system, but she wanted others to take ownership of running it. The final council included Peter Chen for the homesteaders, a miner named Samuel Price, Margaret representing merchants, a rancher named Joshua Wells, and, surprisingly, Martha Harrison. I accept on one condition, Martha said when her name was called, that we use this council to build real infrastructure. Not just resolve disputes, but create schools, coordinate medical care, establish lending systems for families who need capital. If we're going to have governance, let's make it count for something. It was exactly what Evelyn had hoped for, but hadn't dared suggest herself. Martha's resources and social position gave those ideas legitimacy they wouldn't have had coming from anyone else. She caught Martha's eye across the crowd and saw acknowledgement there. Not friendship, but mutual respect and shared purpose. The meeting ended with signatures on a document outlining the basic agreements. Not everyone signed. Marcus Reeves was notably absent, as were Jack Crawford and a few other families. But enough did that Wolf Creek now had something resembling organized governance. You did it, Silas said that evening, both of them exhausted but satisfied. Changed how this valley operates. We'll see if it lasts. Words on paper don't mean much if people won't follow through. They will, because they chose it themselves, and because the alternative is chaos and violence. Even stubborn frontiersmen prefer peace when given a choice. But Silas was only partially right. The system worked for those who wanted it to work. Water disputes were resolved through mediation, lending systems helped families invest in improvements, and the school project moved forward with Margaret coordinating construction. Wolf Creek began to feel like a real town, rather than a collection of isolated homesteads. Yet resistance remained. Marcus Reeves ignored the council's water ruling, building his dam anyway and cutting off the Chen's access. When Peter took the dispute back to the council, they ruled in his favor and asked community members to help dismantle the dam. Marcus responded by threatening anyone who touched his property. The confrontation came on a hot August afternoon. 15 men rode to the Reeves property, including Silas, Peter, and several council members. They weren't looking for violence, just to enforce the community decision. But Marcus met them with a rifle and 2 hired hands, and for a long moment, it looked like blood would be spilled despite everything. "This is wrong, Marcus," Joshua Wells said, speaking as both councilman and fellow rancher. "You're part of this valley. The water's shared resource, always has been. We're not asking you to give up your rights, just to share fairly." "I don't recognize your authority," Marcus spat. "You people want rules, fine, but don't pretend you can enforce them on me." "We can," Silas said quietly. "Because there are 15 of us and 3 of you. Because everyone here is willing to stand up for fair treatment. You want to shoot it out? We'll oblige, but you'll lose, and your family will lose. And for what? A creek that's big enough to share?" The standoff stretched, tension thick enough to choke on. Then one of Marcus's hired hands set down his rifle. "I didn't sign on for dying over water rights, boss. Council's ruling seems fair to me." The second hand followed, and suddenly Marcus was alone with his defiance. He stared at the crowd, at the unified front of neighbors he'd refused to work with, and something in his face crumbled. "Fine," he said, lowering his rifle. "Take your damn down. But I want it noted I did this under duress, not choice." "Noted," Peter said, "and when drought comes again, you'll have the same access rights as my family. That's the deal." They dismantled the dam that afternoon while Marcus watched sullenly from his porch. It wasn't a victory anyone celebrated. Forcing a neighbor to comply felt more sad than triumphant, but it established a precedent. The council's decisions would be enforced, even against those who rejected the system. Jack Crawford was a different problem. He'd been quiet since his confrontation with Silas, but he hadn't disappeared. He still ran his mining claim, still drank at the saloon, still radiated mean-spirited resentment. The difference was that people increasingly isolated him. No one would trade with him, partner with him, or tolerate his presence beyond what politeness demanded. The end came in September, inevitable and anticlimactic. Jack got drunk and picked a fight with a younger miner, someone too inexperienced to recognize how dangerous Jack was. But before violence could erupt, others intervened, not with threats, just with cold removal. They escorted Jack out of the saloon, told him he wasn't welcome back, and made it clear that his choice was to leave the valley or live completely isolated. "You're exiling me," Jack laughed bitterly. "For what? Existing?" "For being a poison to this community," Margaret said, standing with the crowd. "For threatening, stealing, hurting people for entertainment. We're done tolerating it. You can go somewhere else where violence is accepted, or you can change. But you can't stay here as you are." Jack left 2 days later, his companions going with him. Evelyn watched him ride past the ranch without stopping, and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, just relief that a threat had been removed without bloodshed. "That's how you win," Silas observed. "Not by fighting, but by making someone irrelevant. He couldn't survive here without the community, and we stopped being willing to tolerate him." Feels cruel. It's survival. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a poison is refuse to let it spread. Fall brought the first significant test of everything they'd built. Another early winter storm hit in October, but this time the valley was prepared. The resource network activated immediately, families checking on neighbors, sharing supplies, coordinating shelter for those whose homes were inadequate. The council coordinated the response, turning what might have been another crisis into a managed challenge. Evelyn and Silas opened the ranch again, but this time they weren't overwhelmed. Other families opened their homes too, distributing the burden. The school, still under construction, became a community shelter with families rotating through in shifts. Margaret's store served as a coordination point, tracking who needed what and who could provide it. When the storm cleared after 5 days, the valley was intact. Bruised, exhausted, but intact. And more importantly, confident. They'd faced winter's fury with organization and cooperation, and they'd won. "This is what I wanted," Evelyn said, standing on the ridge with Silas as they surveyed the valley. "Not just survival, but resilience. A community that can handle whatever comes. You built it. You and everyone who believed in the vision enough to try." Silas pulled her close. "Question is what comes next. You've organized us, given us structure. What's the next challenge?" Evelyn had been thinking about that. The valley was stable, functional, even prospering by frontier standards. But prosperity brought new challenges, growth, newcomers, the need for more sophisticated systems. They'd solved the immediate problems, but longer-term issues remained. "I want to finish the school," she said. "Want to make sure every child in this valley learns to read and write and think. Because the frontier won't always be frontier. Towns will grow, civilization will arrive whether we want it or not. And I want these kids prepared for that future, not trapped in the past." "So you're taking Margaret's offer, becoming the teacher?" "Part-time. I'll teach 3 days a week, work the ranch the other 4. It's not perfect, but nothing out here is. We make compromises and call it success." Silas laughed. "You're learning. Frontier living is all about good enough solutions that keep you alive until you can find better ones." The school opened in November, a simple log building with a stove, desks Tommy had built, and books Margaret had ordered from back east. 23 children showed up the first day, ranging from 5 to 15, with more education gaps than Evelyn wanted to think about. But they were eager, hungry for knowledge, and she fell in love with teaching all over again. Sarah Henderson's daughters were her star pupils, reading at levels beyond their age. The Patterson boys struggled but worked hard, carrying their father's loss in their quietness, but finding solace in learning. Even some of the older students, teenagers who should have been too proud to sit in a schoolroom, showed up wanting education they'd never had access to before. Teaching reminded Evelyn why she'd become an educator in the first place. Not for the prestige or the comfortable routine, but for the moment when understanding clicked in a student's eyes. For the privilege of watching minds expand and possibilities open. For the knowledge that she was helping build a future that didn't have to repeat the past's mistakes. Winter came again, as it always did, but it was different this time. The valley was prepared, organized, resilient. Storms were managed rather than survived. The resource network functioned smoothly. The council handled disputes and coordinated responses. And the school continued operating through it all, teaching children that even in the hardest conditions, learning was valuable. Evelyn celebrated her second anniversary in Wyoming in the middle of a blizzard, teaching fractions to a classroom of children while snow buried the settlement outside. Silas showed up at noon with lunch, hot stew he'd carried through the storm, and they ate together in the schoolhouse while her students giggled at the romantic gesture. 2 years, he said, since I pulled a half-drowned woman out of a flooded creek and didn't know if she'd survive the week. Honestly, I gave myself 3 days before running back to Boston. What changed? Evelyn looked around the schoolhouse, at the children bent over their slates, at the walls decorated with their drawings, at the stove Tommy had installed that kept them warm even in brutal cold. I stopped trying to survive and started trying to live. Big difference between the two. That night, back at the ranch, they lay in bed listening to the wind howl and talked about the future. The ranch was thriving. They'd expanded to 500 head of cattle, hired 3 additional hands, and built a new barn that was the envy of the valley. The school was succeeding beyond expectations. The community network had evolved into genuine governance. Wolf Creek was no longer just a settlement, it was becoming a town. We should think about children, Silas said quietly. Real ones. Not just the ones you teach. I'd like to try again, if you're willing. Evelyn had been waiting for this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. She'd seen Silas watching her with the school children, seen the longing in his expression when young families visited the ranch. He wanted to be a father again, wanted to fill the emptiness Sarah and Michael's deaths had left. I'm willing, she said. Scared but willing. This place is dangerous for children. Everywhere's dangerous for children. At least here we can teach them to be strong enough to survive it. He turned to face her. I won't lie and say it'll be easy or safe, but I think we're ready, and I think you'd be an incredible mother. Based on what evidence? Based on watching you hold the Patterson boy when he was dying. Based on seeing you teach with a patience I didn't know you had. Based on knowing you're the stubbornest, most capable woman I've ever met, and any child of ours would inherit that. He paused. But if you're not ready, we wait. I won't push. I'm ready, Evelyn said, and meant it. Let's build a family. Add to the legacy we're creating here. Spring arrived 5 months later, and with it came confirmation. Evelyn was pregnant. The news spread through the valley like wildfire, met with congratulations and advice, and the kind of communal excitement that came from shared investment in the future. Women showed up with hand-me-down baby clothes. Men helped Silas build a cradle and nursery additions to the cabin, and Margaret stocked extra supplies at the store in anticipation of the birth. Evelyn continued teaching through the pregnancy, stubbornly refusing to let her growing belly stop her work. The children were fascinated by the visible evidence of new life, asking questions that ranged from innocent to mortifying. She taught them about biology, reproduction, the cycles of birth and growth that governed all living things. And she watched their minds open to the wonder of it all, understanding spreading across faces like dawn. The baby came in early November, delivered by Martha Harrison, who trained in midwifery years ago and never mentioned it until Evelyn needed help. The birth was long and painful and terrifying, with moments when Evelyn was certain she'd died just like Sarah had. But Martha was competent and calm. Silas held her hand and didn't flinch when she screamed, and eventually a baby's cry cut through the fear. A girl, Martha said, placing the tiny, perfect creature in Evelyn's arms. Healthy lungs on her. She's going to be loud. They named her Sarah Evelyn Boone, honoring both the wife Silas had lost and the woman Evelyn had become. The name carried weight, expectations, memories, the pressure of living up to legacies, but it also felt right. This child was a bridge between past and future, between grief and hope. Silas held his daughter with tears streaming down his scarred face, and Evelyn understood that something in him had healed. Not completely, the past wounds never healed completely, but enough.
Enough to risk love again, to believe in futures that included laughter and growth rather than just survival. The valley celebrated the birth with a party that rivaled their wedding, people bringing gifts and food and overwhelming amounts of advice. Sarah Henderson brought clothes her daughters had outgrown. Mary Patterson brought a quilt she'd made specifically for this baby. Margaret brought books, far too advanced for an infant, but perfect for reading aloud. Even Marcus Reeves showed up, grudgingly offering a hand-carved rattle and mumbling something about community obligations. "This child is lucky," Margaret said, holding baby Sarah while Evelyn ate. "Born into a community that'll protect her, teach her, help raise her. Born to parents who know how to fight for what matters. She's got a future here." Evelyn looked around at the faces gathered in her home. People who'd been strangers when she arrived, who'd become neighbors and allies and something approaching family. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. Boston felt like ancient history now, a life that had belonged to someone else entirely. "Thank you," she said to the room at large, "all of you, for welcoming me when I was an outsider, for teaching me to survive here, for building this community alongside us. Sarah's lucky because of you." "We're lucky because of you," Peter Chen said. "You showed us we could be more than isolated homesteaders fighting the frontier alone. You taught us that community makes us stronger." The years that followed were a blur of growth and challenge and hard-won success. Sarah grew into a wild, fearless child who could ride before she could walk, and who approached the world with the kind of confidence that came from being raised by people who'd conquered mountains. A second child followed, a boy they named Thomas after Tommy, who'd become family in all the ways that mattered. And then a third, another girl named Margaret, after the woman who'd been Evelyn's first real friend in the valley. The ranch expanded until it was the largest operation in 3 territories, employing 20 hands and running 2,000 head of cattle. But more importantly, it remained the community center it had become that first terrible winter, a place where families gathered, where children played, where the valley's business was conducted and its future shaped. The school grew into a proper building with multiple classrooms, employing 3 teachers and educating nearly 100 children. Wolf Creek itself transformed into an actual town, with a doctor, a bank, multiple merchants, and enough population to warrant a territorial representative. The council evolved into formal town governance, with elections and ordinances and all the bureaucratic machinery that frontier people had once fled. But underneath the civilization, the frontier spirit remained. People still helped neighbors through hard winters, still worked together when crisis struck, still understood that survival was a collective effort rather than an individual achievement. Wolf Creek had grown up without losing what made it special, the fierce independence tempered by genuine community, the understanding that being strong didn't mean being alone. Evelyn stood on the porch one evening in the fall of their 8th year, watching Silas teach Sarah to throw a rope, while Tommy supervised the younger children. The valley spread out below in shades of gold and amber, beautiful in the way hard things are beautiful when you've learned to appreciate them rather than fear them. "Thinking about Boston?" Silas asked, coming to stand beside her after Sarah successfully lassoed the post she'd been aiming for. "Thinking about how that woman who stepped off the stage wouldn't recognize the woman standing here. Wouldn't believe she'd end up running a ranch, teaching in a frontier school, raising children in a place that tried to kill her. You think she'd be proud? That version of yourself?" Evelyn considered the question. "I think she'd be terrified. And then she'd be amazed. Because I didn't just survive the frontier, I thrived here. Built something that matters, something that'll outlast me. That's more than I ever accomplished in the city, where I was just another invisible teacher counting down to an empty future. You're not invisible here. You're the center of everything. We're the center, you and me together. That's why it works, because we balance each other. Your strength and my organization. Your frontier knowledge and my teaching. Your scars and my stubbornness." She leaned into him. "We built this together. The ranch, the community, the family, all of it." Silas kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "Best thing I ever did was ride into that flood to pull you out. Smartest decision of my life, even though I didn't know it at the time. You almost died saving me. Could have just let me drown. Could have. But then I would have spent the rest of my life alone. And that's a worse fate than drowning." He pulled her closer. "You saved me too, you know. I was dying up here by myself. Maybe not physically, but in every way that mattered. You gave me reason to live again.
not just survive. They stood together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of crimson and gold. Their children's laughter floated up from the yard. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout Wolf Creek, evidence of families settling in for the evening. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Not a threat anymore, just part of the landscape they'd learned to navigate. This was what they'd built from mud and determination and the stubborn refusal to let the frontier break them. Not paradise. Nowhere this hard could ever be paradise. But home. A real home, with roots that went deep and connections that wouldn't break easily. Evelyn thought about the letters that had started all this. The careful words Silas had written describing loneliness and landscape and the honest hardship of frontier living. She'd responded to those letters thinking she was running towards something, escape, adventure, a chance at purpose. But what she'd actually found was herself. The strongest, most capable, most authentic version of herself that could only have emerged from facing impossible challenges and refusing to quit. The frontier hadn't made her strong. It had revealed strength she'd always possessed but never had reason to use. And in the process, it had given her a life worth fighting for, messy and difficult and occasionally terrifying, but infinitely more meaningful than the safe, small existence she'd left behind. "Come on," Silas said, breaking her reverie. "Sarah's practicing her rope work, and she's going to hurt herself if someone doesn't supervise properly. And the younger ones need dinner before they get too wild." They walked down together into the life they'd built, chaotic and loud and full of love expressed through action rather than words. And as Evelyn helped her daughter with the rope, taught her son to be gentle with the chickens, and watched Tommy making the younger girl laugh with silly faces, she understood something fundamental about happiness. It wasn't about comfort or ease or the absence of struggle. It was about finding work that mattered, people worth fighting for, and the strength to keep going when everything argued for giving up. It was about building something larger than yourself and knowing that your life had made a difference in ways both big and small. The storm that had brought her to Black Ridge Crossing 8 years ago hadn't been a disaster. It had been a beginning. The flood hadn't nearly killed her. It had washed away the person she'd been and revealed the person she was meant to become. And the man who'd ridden into that flood to save her hadn't just pulled her from the water. He'd given her a chance to discover what she was really capable of when pushed to her absolute limits. They'd conquered more than the wilderness. They'd conquered loneliness, fear, and the grinding isolation that destroyed people who tried to face the frontier alone. They'd proven that community wasn't weakness, but strength, that helping others didn't diminish you, but elevated everyone. And they'd built a legacy that would outlast them. In the children they'd raised, the students Evelyn had taught, the ranch they'd expanded, the town they'd helped create from nothing but need and determination. Future generations would walk these valleys and never know the names of everyone who'd sacrificed to make it possible. But they'd benefit from that sacrifice anyway, living in a world slightly better because Evelyn and Silas and all the others had refused to let the frontier break them. That evening, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Evelyn and Silas sat by the fire like they had countless times before. The flames cast shadows across walls that had witnessed years of their life together. Arguments and reconciliations, celebrations and losses, the 1,000 small moments that comprised a marriage built on honesty rather than romance. "No regrets?" Silas asked, the question that had become their ritual. "No regrets," Evelyn confirmed. "You?" "Not a single one." He reached for her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with hers. "Thank you for being stubborn enough to stay, for fighting when it would have been easier to run, for building this life with me. Thank you for pulling me out of that creek, for teaching me to survive here, for loving me even when I was difficult. Especially when you were difficult, that's when I knew you were strong enough to last." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside, the frontier night pressed close, dark and vast and full of dangers that would always exist regardless of how much civilization they built. But inside was warmth and family and the certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. That was the real victory, Evelyn realized, not conquering the wilderness or building a successful ranch or even creating a thriving community. The victory was in finding someone who matched your strength, who pushed you to be better, who stood beside you when everything fell apart and celebrated with you when it all came together. The frontier had tested them in every possible way, and they'd passed, not by being perfect, but by being stubborn enough to keep trying even when failure seemed certain. That stubbornness, more than anything else, was their legacy. The refusal to quit, the determination to build something meaningful, the courage to keep loving despite knowing love could end in loss. They taught it to their children, modeled it for their community, and built it into the foundation of everything they'd created. And when Evelyn finally fell asleep that night, wrapped in Silas's arms with the sound of her children breathing softly in nearby rooms, she dreamed not of floods or drowning or the terror that had brought her west. She dreamed of spring coming to the valley, of mountains greening with new growth, of a future stretching endlessly forward, full of challenge and beauty and the hard-won joy of a life fully lived.